Hello, and welcome to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, I invite you to leave the noise of the world behind and join me on an epic 50-chapter journey into the whispers of the desert. You are about to hear the complete saga of the mystery of the Silver Key in its entirety. So, find a comfortable position, dim the lights, and let your mind drift. The Silver Key is about to turn. Our story begins now. Thomas drove his car slowly. The road was very long and straight. There were no other cars on the road. On both sides, there was only orange sand and dry grass. The sun was very hot. It was high in the sky. Thomas looked at his clock. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He felt tired because he drove for many hours. He wanted to sit down and drink a glass of cold water. He looked at the seat next to him. There was an old letter. It was from his Uncle Henry. The letter said, "Thomas, please come to my house. I live in the desert now. I have a big secret, and I need your help. Do not tell anyone." Thomas did not understand why his uncle was so mysterious. Uncle Henry was a wealthy man, but he was also very lonely. Thomas had not seen him for 5 years. Suddenly, Thomas saw a large building in the distance. It was the mansion. It was a very big house made of grey stone. It had 3 floors and many small windows. The house looked very old and very strong. It stood alone in the middle of the desert. There were no trees near the house. There were only rocks and sand. The house looked a little bit scary. Thomas parked his car in front of the house. He turned off the engine. Now, everything was very quiet. He stayed in the car for a minute. He looked at the tall wooden door. He felt a little bit afraid, but he was also curious. Why did Uncle Henry live in this empty place? He took a deep breath and opened the car door. Thomas stepped out of the car. The hot wind hit his face. He grabbed his brown suitcase from the back seat. He walked toward the mansion. The ground was dusty. His shoes were now covered in light sand. He reached the front porch. The porch was made of dark wood. It was in the shade, so it was a little bit cooler there. He felt the dry air in his throat. He stood in front of the door. The door was twice as tall as him. It had a heavy metal handle. Thomas did not see a bell, so he hit the wood with his hand. The sound of his knock was loud in the quiet afternoon. He waited. He did not hear anything at first. He looked at the windows. He thought he saw a white curtain move on the second floor. Was someone watching him from above? Thomas knocked again. "Uncle Henry." He called out. His voice felt small in the big desert. Then, he heard a sound from the other side. It was the sound of a metal key turning in a lock. It was a slow, heavy sound. The door began to open. A cool wind came from inside the house. It smelled like old paper and expensive perfume. Thomas held his suitcase tightly and waited to see who was there. The door opened slowly. A woman stood there. She was tall and thin. She wore a long black dress that reached the floor. Her hair was grey and tied in a very tight bun. She had a serious face with deep lines around her mouth. Her eyes were sharp and blue. She looked at Thomas from head to toe. She did not smile. "You must be Thomas," she said. Her voice was low and very calm. "Yes, I am. I am Henry's nephew," Thomas replied. He tried to smile to be polite, but the woman did not respond. "I am Mrs. Gable. I am the housekeeper here," she explained. "I have worked for your uncle for many years. Please, come inside quickly. The sand belongs outside, not on the carpets." Thomas stepped into the house. The interior was very different from the hot desert outside. The air was cold and smelled like wax and old wood. The floor was made of white marble that shone in the light. A large chandelier hung from the high ceiling. It was made of glass and gold, but only a few bulbs were lit. There were many paintings on the walls. Most of them were portraits of people Thomas did not know. The house was very clean, but it felt empty and sad. "Where is my uncle?" Thomas asked. He looked around the large, quiet hallway. "Mr. Henry is in his study," Mrs. Gable said. She closed the heavy front door. The lock made a sharp, metallic sound. "He is very busy today. He told me to show you to your room first. You can see him at dinner time." "Is he okay?" Thomas asked. His letter sounded worried. Mrs. Gable stopped walking. She turned around and looked at Thomas. She stayed silent for a moment. Her expression did not change. "This is a big house, Mr. Thomas. It is full of old things and old stories. Sometimes, your uncle thinks too much. He is an older man now. He sees things that are not there." She began to walk up the wide wooden stairs. Thomas followed her. The wood made a low, rubbing sound under their feet. The stairs were dark and polished. On the second floor, there was a long hallway with many closed doors. Mrs. Gable stopped at the third door on the left. She opened it with a small key she kept in her pocket. "This is your room," she said, pointing inside. The room was large and comfortable. It had a big bed with white sheets and many pillows. There was a heavy wooden desk near the window. From the window, Thomas could see the endless sand and the bright, orange sun. There was also a large wardrobe for his clothes. "Dinner is at 7 o'clock," Mrs. Gable said. "Please do not walk around the house before then. Your uncle likes his privacy. He does not like people near his study." She turned and walked away without saying goodbye. Thomas stood in the doorway. He heard her footsteps get quieter and quieter. Then, he heard the sound of a door closing far away. He was alone. He put his suitcase on the bed. He felt like a guest, but also like a prisoner. He looked at the desk. There was a small silver tray on it. On the tray, there was a glass of water and a small piece of white paper. Thomas picked up the paper. It looked empty, but he felt it was important. Thomas waited in his room until the clock on the wall showed exactly 7 o'clock. The sun was now below the horizon. The sky was a deep purple color, and the desert was dark. He left his room and walked down the long hallway. The house was very quiet. He could only hear the soft sound of his own breathing. He found the dining room on the first floor. It was a very large room with a very long wooden table. Uncle Henry sat at the end of the table. He looked much older than Thomas remembered. His face was very pale, and his hands moved a little bit all the time. He wore a dark blue suit that looked too big for his thin body. When he saw Thomas, he did not stand up. He only looked at him with tired, watery eyes. "Thomas," Henry said. His voice was thin and dry. "Thank you for coming. Sit down, please." Thomas sat in a chair near his uncle. Mrs. Gable entered the room with 2 plates of food. She moved like a shadow. She put a plate of chicken and vegetables in front of Thomas and another in front of Henry. She did not say a word. She poured some red juice into their glasses and then left the room. "How are you, Uncle?" Thomas asked. He picked up his fork, but he was not very hungry. Henry looked at the door to make sure Mrs. Gable was gone. He leaned forward. His face was full of fear. "I am not well, Thomas. I am in danger. That is why I asked you to come. I cannot trust anyone in this house." Thomas felt a cold shiver. "Danger? What do you mean? Is someone trying to hurt you?" Henry nodded slowly. "Someone is following me. I see them in the distance when I look out the window. I see a dark car on the road at night. But it is worse than that. I think someone is following me inside this house, too. But the house is in the middle of the desert. Thomas said. There are no neighbors for miles. And the doors are always locked. Locks do not stop everyone. Henry whispered. He looked at the dark corners of the large room. I hear footsteps in the middle of the night. I find things moved on my desk. I am a wealthy man. Thomas. People want what I have. They want the silver key. The silver key. What is that? Thomas asked. Henry shook his head quickly. Not now. It is not safe to talk here. The walls in this house have ears. Just promise me one thing. Stay close to me. Do not go out at night. Suddenly, the wind pushed hard against the large glass windows. The glass made a low, vibrating sound. Henry jumped in his chair and dropped his spoon. The spoon hit the floor with a sharp, metallic sound. He looked at the window with wide eyes. He was trembling. Thomas realized his uncle was not just tired. He was terrified. Thomas woke up early the next morning. The desert sun was already hot. Light came through the window and made patterns on the floor. He felt a little bit nervous. He remembered his uncle's words from the night before. I am in danger, Henry had said. Thomas wanted to see if his uncle was okay. He got dressed quickly and left his room. The hallway was very quiet. He did not see Mrs. Gable. He walked down the stairs. The house was cold, even with the sun outside. He went to the door of Uncle Henry's study. This was the room where Henry spent all his time. It was a heavy door made of dark oak wood. Thomas reached out and turned the metal handle. The handle did not move. It was locked. Thomas was surprised. Usually, the study was open during the day. He hit the door with his hand. Uncle Henry. He called out. It is Thomas. Are you awake? There was no answer. He listened closely. He did not hear the sound of a chair moving. He did not hear the sound of papers. The room was silent. He tried the handle again, but it was stuck. He looked down at the keyhole. There was no key on the outside. This meant the door was locked from the inside. Is something wrong? A voice asked. Thomas jumped. He turned around and saw Mrs. Gable. She was standing at the end of the hallway. She held a tray with a silver teapot and 2 cups. Her face was as calm as a stone. The door is locked. Thomas said. My uncle is not answering. Mrs. Gable walked toward him. Her shoes made a soft, rhythmic sound on the marble floor. She looked at the door. He is probably sleeping, Mr. Thomas. He had a very bad night. He was very restless. But he told me to stay close. Thomas said. I want to make sure he is safe. Can we open the door? Mrs. Gable shook her head. I do not have the key for this door. Mr. Henry has the only key. He keeps it in his pocket at all times. He does not like people to enter his study without permission. But what if he is hurt? Thomas asked. He felt a knot in his stomach. Mrs. Gable put the tray down on a small table. She looked at the door for a long time. Then, she leaned her head against the wood and listened. She waited for a full minute. She did not hear anything. Mr. Henry. She shouted. Her voice was much louder now. Mr. Henry, please open the door. Still, there was no reply. The silence in the house felt heavy. Thomas looked at the windows of the study from the outside later, but they were high and had metal bars. He began to feel that something was very wrong. The beautiful mansion felt like a trap. Thomas and Mrs. Gable stood in the silent hallway. They looked at the locked door of the study. Thomas wanted to break the door open, but he was afraid to damage his uncle's house. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by a new sound. It was the sound of a car engine coming from the front of the mansion. Thomas walked to the large front window and looked out. A black car was driving through the sand. It stopped near Thomas's car. The desert wind blew dust against the black paint. A man stepped out of the car. He was tall and wore a very expensive black suit. He held a leather briefcase in his right hand. He looked at the house with a serious expression. "Who is that?" Thomas asked. Mrs. Gable walked to the window and looked out. "That is Mr. White," she said. Her voice was cold. "He is your uncle's lawyer. He comes from the city. Mr. Henry told me he was coming today to talk about a very important document." The man walked to the front door. A moment later, a heavy metal sound came from the porch. He was using the door knocker. Mrs. Gable went to the door and opened it. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," the man said. He walked into the house without waiting for an invitation. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were small and dark. He looked at Thomas. "And you must be the nephew." "Thomas, correct?" "Yes, I am," Thomas said. "How do you know my name?" "Your uncle talks about you," Mr. White said. He did not shake Thomas's hand. He looked at the stairs. "Where is Henry?" "We have a meeting at 10 o'clock. It is very important. I have the documents here in my briefcase." "We have a problem," Thomas explained. "The study door is locked. My uncle is inside, but he does not answer us. We are worried about him." Mr. White moved his eyebrows. He looked surprised, but he did not look worried. He looked more annoyed. "Locked? Henry is a very punctual man. He never misses a meeting, especially not a meeting about his will and the silver key." The silver key again, Thomas thought. He looked at the lawyer's briefcase. "What is in that document, Mr. White?" "That is private legal business," Mr. White replied. He walked toward the study door. He turned the handle, but it did not move. He hit the door 3 times with his fist. The sound was deep and heavy. "Henry, open the door. It is White. I have the papers for you to sign." There was no sound from inside the room. The house felt even quieter than before. Mr. White looked at Mrs. Gable. "Do you have a second key?" "No," Mrs. Gable said. "I already told Thomas. Mr. Henry has the only key." Mr. White looked at the heavy wood of the door. He looked at the narrow space under the door. Then he looked at Thomas. "Something is wrong," the lawyer said. "Henry is always in that chair by 10 o'clock. If he is not answering, we must find a way inside." Thomas looked at Mr. White. The lawyer's face was very serious. Thomas knew they could not wait any longer. If Uncle Henry was sick or hurt inside the room, every minute was important. Thomas looked at the heavy door. It was made of thick wood, but the lock was old. "We must break the door," Thomas said. He felt his heart beating fast in his chest. Mr. White nodded. "I will help you. We can push together." Mrs. Gable stood back. She held her hands together tightly. She looked worried, but she did not try to stop them. Thomas and Mr. White moved to the side of the hallway. They ran toward the door and hit it with their shoulders. The door did not move. It felt like a stone wall. They tried again. They pushed with all their strength. Suddenly, the wood around the lock made a sharp, breaking noise. The door flew open and hit the wall inside the room. Thomas and Mr. White almost fell onto the floor. They stood up quickly and looked around the study. The room was very quiet. It was a large room with many tall bookshelves. The walls were covered with thousands of old books. There was a large wooden desk in the center of the room. A green lamp was on the desk, but the light was off. A pair of reading glasses sat next to a stack of papers. "Uncle Henry," Thomas called out. There was no answer. The room was empty. Thomas walked to the desk. The chair was pushed back, as if someone had just stood up. He looked at the floor, but he did not see anything unusual. He went to the large window at the back of the room. He pulled the heavy velvet curtains aside. The window was closed. Thomas tried to pull the handle, but it was locked from the inside. He looked through the glass. Outside, the desert was bright and empty. There were no footprints in the sand near the window. "He is not here," Mr. White said. He sounded very confused. He walked around the room, looking behind the bookshelves and under the large table. "How is this possible? The door was locked from the inside. The window is locked from the inside. There is no other way out of this room." Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway. She did not enter the room. She looked at the empty chair with wide eyes. "He was here last night," she whispered. "I brought him his tea at 9 o'clock. He locked the door behind me. I heard the key turn." Thomas felt a cold chill. He looked at the ceiling and the walls. The room was like a box. There were no holes and no other doors. His uncle was a thin, older man. He could not disappear into thin air. "Look at this," Mr. White said. He pointed to the desk. On top of the papers, there was a small, round mark in the dust. It looked like something small and heavy had been there, but now it was gone. Thomas remembered his uncle's words about the silver key. Was that what was missing? Thomas stood in the middle of the empty study. He felt very confused. How can a man disappear from a locked room? Mr. White walked around the desk again. He looked under the rug. He touched the books on the shelves. He was looking for a secret door, but he found nothing. The room was a mystery. Suddenly, the sound of a second car engine came from the front of the house. This engine was much louder than the lawyer's car. It sounded like a powerful sports car. Thomas and Mr. White looked at each other. Mrs. Gable walked to the window in the hallway. "More people are here," she said. Her voice sounded tired. Thomas followed her to the front door. He saw a bright red car parked next to the black sedan. The desert sun made the red paint shine like a fire. Two people stepped out of the car. One was a man with short, blonde hair and a very expensive watch. He wore a white shirt and grey trousers. The other was a woman with long, dark hair and very large sunglasses. She wore a bright yellow dress. They both looked like they belonged in a big city, not in the middle of a sandy desert. They walked up the steps to the porch. The man did not knock. He opened the door and walked inside. He looked at Thomas with a hard expression. "Where is Henry?" the man asked. He did not say hello. He sounded angry. "Who are you?" Thomas asked. "This is Victor," Mr. White said, walking into the hallway. "And this is Diana. They were Henry's business partners many years ago. I told them about the meeting today." Diana took off her sunglasses. Her eyes moved quickly around the room. She looked at the expensive paintings and the gold chandelier. "We heard there was an important meeting about the silver key," she said. Her voice was sharp and fast. "We have a right to be here. Henry owes us a lot of money. My uncle is missing," Thomas said clearly. Victor laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "Missing? Henry is always playing games. He probably found a way to hide so he doesn't have to pay us. He is a very smart man, but he is also very dishonest." "That is not true," Thomas said. He felt his face get hot. The room was locked from the inside. "He is gone. We are worried about his safety." Victor and Diana looked at the broken study door. They saw the wood on the floor. Victor walked into the study and looked at the empty chair. He touched the stack of papers on the desk. He looked disappointed. If he is gone, where is the key? Diana asked. She looked at Mrs. Gable. You are the housekeeper. You see everything. Where did he go? Mrs. Gable shook her head. I do not know. I only know that the house is not safe today. You should all leave. We are not leaving without our money, Victor said. He sat down in a chair in the hallway. We will wait here until Henry comes back, even if it takes all night. The atmosphere in the house changed. Now, there were 5 adults in the mansion, and nobody trusted anyone. Thomas looked at the 4 strangers. He realized that the mystery of the silver key was much bigger than he thought. Thomas looked at Mr. White. The lawyer was holding his briefcase very tightly. His knuckles were white. The room was full of tension. Victor and Diana were sitting on a velvet sofa in the hallway. They looked like they were waiting for a show to begin. Thomas felt that he was the only person who truly cared about Uncle Henry's life. To the others, Henry was just a person with a treasure. Mr. White, Thomas said. His voice was firm. You mentioned a silver key. My uncle mentioned it, too. What is it? Why are these people here for it? Mr. White sighed. He took a white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead. Your uncle was a very successful man, Thomas. He collected many rare things. But his most important possession is inside a safe in this house. He called it his life's work. We don't know exactly what is inside. Some say it is gold. Others say it is a secret that can change the world. And the key? Thomas asked. The safe is made of a very strong metal. Mr. White explained. It cannot be broken. It has a special lock. That lock only opens with a specific key made of pure silver. Henry always kept that key with him. He told me that if the key was ever lost, the safe would stay closed forever. Victor stood up. He walked toward Thomas. He was taller than Thomas and tried to look scary. Henry didn't just collect those things. Kid. We helped him. We gave him the money to start his business. He promised us a share of the safe's contents. But then he moved to this desert and stopped answering our calls. He moved because he was afraid of you. Thomas said. He did not move back. He stood his ground. Diana laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. He was afraid of his own shadow. Henry was always a nervous man. But he was also very clever. He knew that as long as he had the key, we couldn't take what was ours. Thomas looked at Mrs. Gable. She was standing by the stairs. She was watching everyone. But she said nothing. Her face was like a mask. Thomas wondered if she knew where the key was. Or maybe she knew where Henry was. If the key is gone, and Henry is gone, then the safe is useless. Mr. White said. He looked at the broken door of the study. But I don't think Henry is gone. I think he is testing us. He wants to see who is greedy and who is loyal. I don't care about his tests. Victor said. He looked at the walls of the hallway. I'm going to search this house. Every room. Every corner. If that key is here, I will find it. You cannot do that. Thomas shouted. This is my uncle's home. Try and stop me. Victor replied. He began to walk toward the kitchen. The house felt smaller now. It was full of people who did not like each other. Outside, the wind was getting stronger. The sand hit the windows with a soft, constant sound. It felt like the desert was trying to get inside. Thomas knew he had to find the key first. He had to find his uncle before Victor and Diana did something terrible. Thomas looked out the large window in the hallway. The sky was not blue anymore. It was a strange, dark orange color. The sun was hidden behind a thick cloud of dust. The wind was getting much faster now. It moved the sand in circles on the ground. Then, Thomas saw it. A giant wall of orange sand was moving across the desert. It was very tall and very wide. It was coming straight toward the mansion. "Look at the sky!" Thomas shouted. Mr. White and Diana ran to the window. Victor came back from the kitchen. His face was pale. They all watched the wall of sand. It looked like a giant wave in the ocean, but it was made of dry earth. A sandstorm. Mrs. Gable said. She appeared from the shadows of the dining room. She looked calm, but her eyes were wide. "A very big one. We must close all the shutters and lock the doors." Suddenly, the wind hit the house. The mansion was made of heavy stone, but it felt like it moved a little bit. The windows began to shake in their frames. The sand hit the glass with a constant, scratching sound. It sounded like thousands of tiny fingers were trying to get inside. The light from outside disappeared. The hallway became very dark. Mrs. Gable walked quickly through the house. She pulled heavy wooden shutters over the windows. One by one, the views of the desert disappeared. Thomas helped her in the living room. He pushed the heavy bolts into place. The sound of the wind was now a deep, low roar. It was a lonely and scary sound. It felt like the house was at the bottom of a dark sea. "The road will be covered in sand," Mr. White said. He sat down on a chair. He looked very tired. "Nobody can drive a car in this. We cannot leave. And the police cannot come here." "How long will it last?" Diana asked. She was holding her yellow dress tightly. She looked at the ceiling. The house made a low, groaning sound as the wind pushed against the roof. "Maybe a few hours. Maybe 2 days," Mrs. Gable replied. She went to a small cupboard and took out some candles. The electricity might fail. The desert is in control now. Victor walked to the front door. He tried to look through the small peephole, but he could see nothing but orange dust. He turned back to the group. "So, we are trapped here. We are trapped in a house with a missing man, a secret safe, and a thief." "Who is the thief, Victor?" Thomas asked. He stepped toward the man. "You are the one who wants to steal my uncle's things." "I want what he promised me," Victor shouted. His voice was loud, but it was almost lost in the sound of the wind. Thomas looked at the faces of the people in the room. The candlelight made their shadows look very long and strange on the walls. They were all stuck together. There was no way out. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a cage. Thomas felt a cold fear in his heart. He needed to find his uncle, but now he also needed to stay safe. The group sat in the living room. The candlelight was small and orange. It made long, dancing shadows on the walls. Everyone was silent. They were listening to the storm. The wind was very strong outside. It pushed against the thick stone walls of the mansion. Thomas did not want to sit and wait. He felt that time was running out. He needed to find a clue. He stood up slowly. "Where are you going?" Diana asked. She looked at him with narrow eyes. She did not trust anyone. "I am thirsty," Thomas said. "I'm going to the kitchen for some water." He walked out of the room. He did not look back. The hallway was very dark and cold. He used a small candle to see the floor. He reached the kitchen. It was a large room with many silver cabinets and a big stove. Everything was very clean. Mrs. Gable was a very organized person. The air smelled like soap and old spices. Thomas did not go to the sink. Instead, he looked at the floor. He saw a small metal trash can near the back door. It was almost empty. He opened the lid. Inside, there was a small piece of paper. It was crumpled into a ball. Thomas picked it up. His hands were shaking a little bit. He felt like he was doing something dangerous. He smoothed the paper on the cold stone counter. It was a photograph. The photo was old, and the colors were a bit yellow. It showed two men standing in front of a tall building. One man was definitely a young Uncle Henry. He was smiling and looked very happy. He was holding a small silver object in his hand. It was the silver key. The other man in the photo was missing. The paper was torn in half. Thomas could only see a hand on Henry's shoulder. The hand was large and wore a heavy gold ring with a big black stone. It was a very unusual ring. Who was this person? Why was the photo torn? Thomas looked at the back of the photo. There were some words written in black ink. It said, "The beginning of the end. 1985. Thomas felt a cold chill in his bones. 1985 was many years ago. What happened then? He thought about Victor and Diana. Were they part of this beginning? He heard a soft sound behind him. It was the sound of a shoe hitting the floor. It was a very light sound, but the house was so quiet that he heard it clearly. He quickly put the photo into his pocket and turned around. He hid the candle behind his body. The kitchen door was open a few inches. A shadow moved in the dark hallway. "Is that you, Mrs. Gable?" Thomas asked. His voice was a whisper. No one answered. The only sound was the roar of the wind outside. Thomas held his candle tightly. He realized that someone was watching him. The secret of the silver key was not just about money or a safe. It was about the past. And the past was starting to come back to the house. He felt that he was no longer alone in the kitchen. Thomas walked out of the kitchen and into the dark hallway. He held his candle high. The light moved against the cold stone walls. He looked for the person who was watching him. He saw a figure near the stairs. It was Mrs. Gable. She stood perfectly still. Her black dress made her look like part of the shadows. "You should be with the others, Mr. Thomas," she said. Her voice was flat and dry. She did not look surprised to see him. Thomas did not move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the torn photograph. He held it out so she could see it. The candlelight hit the yellow paper. "I found this in the trash can," he said. "It is my uncle. He looks very young and very happy. But the other half of the photo is missing." Mrs. Gable looked at the photo for a long time. Her eyes did not move. She did not say anything. The only sound in the hallway was the deep roar of the sandstorm outside. The wind hit the house again and again. "Do you know who this is?" Thomas asked. He pointed to the large hand on Henry's shoulder. "Look at this ring. It has a big black stone. It is very special. Surely you have seen it before." Mrs. Gable finally looked up at Thomas. Her face was as hard as a rock. "I have no idea who that is, Mr. Thomas. Your uncle had many friends in the past. He also had many enemies. I only started working for him 20 years ago. This photo is much older than that." The back of the photo says 1985. Thomas said. He watched her face closely. He saw a small muscle move in her cheek. She was nervous. "Were you here in 1985? "No," she replied quickly. "I was not. I do not know anything about his life before he moved to the desert. Now, please give that to me. It is trash. I must keep the house clean." She reached for the photo, but Thomas pulled his hand back. He put the paper back into his pocket. "I will keep it," he said. "My uncle is missing. This might be a clue. Why would someone throw this away today?" It was on top of the trash. Mrs. Gable narrowed her eyes. Sometimes it is better to leave the past alone. Some secrets are hidden for a reason. If you go looking for trouble, you will find it. She turned around and began to walk up the stairs. She did not use a candle. She moved through the darkness as if she could see perfectly. Thomas watched her go. He did not believe her. He saw the way her hand shook when she looked at the photo. She knew the man with the black ring. She was lying to him. Thomas felt a heavy weight in his chest. He was in a house full of strangers and liars. He looked at the kitchen door. He wondered if someone else was still hiding in the shadows. He decided to go back to the living room. He wanted to see if Victor, Diana, or Mr. White wore a ring with a black stone. Thomas walked slowly back toward the living room. The candle in his hand flickered in the cold air. The wind outside was a constant, low growl that made the house feel like it was moving. Before he reached the main room, he heard loud voices. They were coming from the hallway near the library. It was Victor and Diana. They were not with Mr. White anymore. They were alone, and they were very angry. Thomas stopped behind a large stone pillar. He blew out his candle so they would not see the light. He stayed very still and listened. "You said it was in the safe, Victor," Diana shouted. Her voice was high and sharp. "You said we just needed the silver key. But if the contract is not there, we have nothing. We spent years looking for this place." "I am sure it is there," Victor replied. His voice was deep and full of frustration. "Henry took it from the office 30 years ago. He kept it to protect himself. Without that paper, we cannot prove our ownership of the company. We need that money, Diana." "If the lawyer finds it first, we are going to jail," Diana said. She was pacing back and forth. The sound of her shoes on the marble floor was a fast, rhythmic tapping. "We need to find Henry. He is the only one who knows the truth about the fire in 1985. The fire." Thomas felt a cold sweat on his forehead. This was more than just a business argument. They were talking about a crime. He leaned forward a little bit to see them better. He looked at Victor's hands. Victor was holding a small flashlight. He wore an expensive gold watch, but his fingers were empty. Then Thomas looked at Diana. She had many rings on her fingers. They were bright and shiny, but none of them had a large black stone like the one in the photo. "Someone is coming," Victor whispered suddenly. Thomas froze. He pressed his back against the cold stone pillar. He did not breathe. He heard the sound of slow footsteps on the stairs. It was Mr. White. The lawyer was walking down with a heavy look on his face. He held his leather briefcase close to his chest. "Why are you two shouting?" Mr. White asked. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. "The whole house can hear you. We are in a serious situation. A man is missing, and a storm is trapping us here. We should work together." "We are just nervous, White," Victor said. He tried to sound calm, but his voice was shaking. "We want to find our friend Henry." "Friend?" Mr. White said with a cold smile. "I do not think Henry has many friends in this room. I think he has people who want his secrets." Thomas stayed in the shadows until they all walked back into the living room. He felt the old photo in his pocket. He realized that everyone in the house had a secret. Victor and Diana were worried about a contract and a fire. Mr. White was watching everyone. And Mrs. Gable was hiding the truth about the past. Thomas felt like he was in the middle of a spider web. He needed to find the library. Maybe the contract was hidden there. Thomas waited until the voices in the living room became a soft hum. He walked quietly to the library. This room was even larger than the study. The walls were covered with thousands of books from the floor to the very high ceiling. There was a long wooden ladder on wheels that moved along the shelves. The air here was dry and smelled like dust and leather. The only light came from the small candle Thomas carried. The sandstorm continued to roar outside. The library had no windows, so it felt like a silent tomb. Thomas needed a flashlight. He knew the candle would not last long. He looked on the large mahogany desk, but he only found old pens and a heavy glass paperweight. He began to search the lower shelves near the desk. He pushed aside some large books about history and law. Behind a thick, red book titled Ancient Secrets, Thomas saw something strange. It was not another book. It was a small handle made of cold, dark iron. It was hidden deep in the shadows of the shelf. Thomas reached out and touched it. The metal was very cold. He wondered if this was what his uncle meant when he said the house had secrets. Thomas looked at the door to make sure he was still alone. He could hear the low, rhythmic thumping of the wind against the house, but no footsteps. He took a deep breath and pulled the iron handle toward him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, he heard a deep, grinding sound from behind the wall. It was the sound of heavy stones moving against each other. It was slow and very loud in the quiet library. Thomas watched in surprise as a section of the bookshelf began to move backward. It did not swing like a door. It slid into the wall. A small, dark opening appeared where the books used to be. It was just wide enough for a person to walk through. A cold, damp wind came out of the hole. It smelled like wet earth and old metal. Thomas held his candle near the opening. He could see a narrow stone staircase going down into the darkness. "This is it," Thomas whispered to himself. "This is how he disappeared." He looked back at the library door. He knew he should probably tell the others, but he did not trust them. Victor and Diana wanted the contract. Mr. White wanted the safe. Mrs. Gable was hiding something. If he wanted to find Uncle Henry, he had to go alone. He stepped into the narrow opening. His heart was beating very fast against his ribs. The stone walls felt very close to his shoulders. He began to walk down the first step, holding the wall for balance. The mystery of the silver key was waiting for him in the dark. Thomas stepped into the dark passage. The opening was very small. He had to bend his body to enter. The air inside the wall was very different from the rest of the house. It was cold and smelled like old metal and dry dust. He held his candle in front of him. The light was small, but he could see the walls. They were made of grey stone and old wood. The passage was very narrow. Thomas could touch both walls at the same time. He moved slowly. He was afraid the floor might be weak, but the wood under his feet felt strong. He walked deeper into the wall. The sound of the sandstorm became very quiet. The thick stone of the mansion was like a blanket. It blocked all the noise from the outside world. After a few meters, the passage turned to the left. Thomas saw a small ladder made of iron. It went down into the floor. He looked down, but he could only see deep darkness. He felt a little bit of fear. This was a secret part of the house. Did the lawyer know about this? Did the housekeeper? He did not know, but he knew he had to continue. He began to climb down the ladder. He held the cold iron with one hand and his candle with the other. The ladder was very long. Finally, his feet touched a hard floor. He was in a narrow tunnel. The tunnel was long and straight. There were small lamps on the walls, but they were not lit. They looked like old gas lamps from a long time ago. Thomas walked down the tunnel. He saw something white on the ground. He bent down and picked it up. It was a small, white handkerchief. It had the letter H sewn into the corner. It belonged to his Uncle Henry. The handkerchief was clean, but it was crumpled. Uncle Henry was definitely here, Thomas whispered. He felt a little bit of hope. He was following his uncle's path. But then, he heard a heavy sound from the library above him. It was a grinding sound. It was the sound of the bookshelf moving back into its place. Thomas ran back to the ladder and looked up, but he was too late. The small square of light from the library disappeared. He heard the sharp sound of the metal lever clicking. The secret door was now closed. Thomas was alone in the dark tunnel under the mansion. He looked at his candle. It was getting smaller and smaller. He had to find another way out, or he would be in total darkness very soon. He turned and looked at the long, dark tunnel. He had to keep moving forward into the mystery. Thomas stood still in the dark tunnel. He looked at his small candle. The fire was very low. The air in the tunnel was thin. He knew he could not stay there for a long time. He began to walk forward again. The stone walls were cold when he touched them. Suddenly, he felt a small vibration in the ground. A very heavy object hit the roof of the mansion far above him. It was probably a piece of a tree or a rock moved by the sandstorm. At that exact moment, the house became even more silent. Thomas looked up at the ceiling of the tunnel. There were small electric wires near the top. He saw a tiny spark of light from a wire, but then it disappeared. The electricity was gone. The desert storm finally broke the power lines outside. Thomas found a small metal grate in the wall of the tunnel. It was a vent for air. He put his eye near the metal bars. He could see into the main living room of the mansion. The room was almost completely black. He could only see the white shapes of the furniture. The lights. Diana shouted from the room. Her voice was full of fear. Everything stopped working. I cannot see anything. Stay calm, Mr. White's voice said. He sounded close to the window. It is just the storm. The wires are probably down. Do not move or you will break something. I am not moving, Victor said. Thomas could hear the sound of Victor's heavy breathing. But we are trapped in the dark with a crazy man and a ghost. Suddenly, a small light appeared at the far end of the hallway. It was a soft, yellow glow. It moved slowly toward the living room. It was Mrs. Gable. She held a large silver tray. On the tray, there were 5 tall white candles in glass holders. The light from the candles made her face look like a pale mask. She looked very calm, as if she expected the darkness. The power will not return tonight, Mrs. Gable said. She walked into the room and put the tray on the table. She gave 1 candle to Mr. White and 1 to Victor. She held a 3rd candle toward Diana. Take these. They will last for many hours. Where is the boy? Mr. White asked. He looked around the room. The candlelight showed his worried eyes. Where is Thomas? He went to the kitchen a long time ago. Mrs. Gable did not answer immediately. She lit the last candle. I saw him near the library, she said quietly. Maybe he went to his room to sleep. Or maybe he is lost in the dark. Thomas felt a cold shiver. Mrs. Gable knew he was not in his room. She saw him near the library where the secret door was located. Was she protecting him, or was she waiting for him to disappear? He watched from behind the grate as Victor took his candle and walked toward the hallway. I am going to find that kid, Victor said. He knows something. He was too quiet at dinner. Thomas moved away from the grate. He had to find a way out of the tunnel before Victor reached the library. He turned and ran into the darkness, his small candle flickering in the cold wind of the passage. Thomas moved quickly through the dark tunnel. His candle was now a very small piece of wax. He found another iron ladder at the end of the narrow passage. This ladder went up, not down. He climbed carefully. At the top, he found a small wooden panel. He pushed it slowly. Thomas stepped out and realized he was inside a large storage closet. He opened the closet door and saw he was back in the guest hallway on the 2nd floor. Suddenly, a loud, sharp cry broke the silence of the mansion. It was a woman's voice. The sound was high and full of terror. It echoed off the stone walls and moved through the dark house. Thomas stayed in the shadows of the closet door. He saw Victor and Mr. White running down the hallway. They held their candles high, and the light jumped against the walls. They stopped in front of Diana's room. "Diana! What happened?" Victor shouted. He pushed the door open. Thomas followed them quietly. He stood in the doorway and looked inside. Diana was standing in the middle of the room. Her hands were covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fear. She was pointing at her bed. On the bed, her large suitcase was open. On top of her silk clothes, there was a small object that did not belong there. It was a silver box. It was about the size of a large book. It was very shiny and had beautiful patterns of roses carved into the metal. There was no lock on the box, but it looked very heavy. "Where did that come from?" Mr. White asked. He walked closer to the bed. "I don't know," Diana said. Her voice was shaking. "I came up here to get my heavy coat because the house is so cold. I opened my suitcase, and there it was. It was not there this morning. I packed my bag myself. I know every item inside it." Victor reached out to touch the box, but Diana grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "It might be a trap. Maybe Henry put it there." "Henry is missing," Victor said. He looked around the dark room. The curtains were moving a little bit because of the wind outside. "If Henry put this here, it means he is still in the house. He is watching us." Mr. White picked up the box. He looked at it closely in the candlelight. "This is very old silver," he said. "It is very expensive. Look at the bottom." He turned the box over. There was a small mark on the bottom. It was a symbol of a key. Thomas felt the photo in his pocket. He remembered the silver key in the picture. Was the key inside this box? "Open it," Victor commanded. Mr. White put his fingers on the lid. He pulled it up slowly. The metal made a soft, singing sound as it opened. Everyone leaned forward to look inside. Diana held her breath. But when the lid was fully open, they all looked confused. The box was lined with blue velvet, but it was completely empty. There was nothing inside but the smell of old roses. Thomas watched the group from the doorway. They were all looking at the empty silver box with confusion. Diana looked angry, and Victor looked like he wanted to break something. Mr. White was quiet. He was looking at the box as if it were a puzzle. Thomas felt that this was the best time to leave. He did not want them to ask where he was during the last hour. He turned around and walked quietly back to his own room. The hallway was very dark now. The only light came from the small candle in his hand. The floorboards made a low, rubbing sound as he walked. He entered his room and closed the door. He leaned against the wood for a moment. He was very tired. His clothes were covered in dust from the secret tunnel. He took off his jacket and put the old photo on the desk. He walked to the large bed. He wanted to lie down for a few minutes to think. He moved the heavy white pillow to get comfortable. Suddenly, he felt something cold and flat under the fabric. It was not a part of the bed. He reached his hand under the pillow and pulled out a small piece of white paper. The paper was folded in half. Thomas opened it slowly. The paper made a soft, dry sound in the quiet room. There was a single sentence written in black ink. The handwriting was very neat, but the letters were small. It said, "Do not trust the lawyer." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. His heart began to beat faster. Who put this note here? It was not there when he arrived. Someone had entered his room while he was in the tunnel or in the kitchen. He thought about Mr. White. The lawyer seemed helpful, but he was also very interested in the silver key. He wanted the legal documents. He wanted the safe. "Do not trust the lawyer," Thomas whispered to himself. He looked at the door. Was the person who wrote the note trying to help him? Or was it a trick to make him turn against Mr. White? He thought about the other people in the house. Victor and Diana were clearly greedy. Mrs. Gable was hiding something about the year 1985. But Mr. White was the one who knew the most about his uncle's business. Thomas stood up and walked to the window. He opened the heavy wooden shutter just a little bit. He could see nothing but a wall of orange sand. The sand hit the glass with a constant, scratching sound. The storm was not stopping. He was trapped in this house with people who were playing a dangerous game. He looked at the note again. The ink was fresh. This meant the person was in his room very recently. He checked the wardrobe and under the bed. He was alone, but he did not feel safe. He decided to hide the note inside his shoe. He needed to be very careful. If the note was right, the lawyer was a dangerous man. But if the note was a lie, then someone was trying to start a fight. Thomas blew out his candle and sat in the dark, listening to the house. Thomas stayed in his room for a few minutes. He felt the small note inside his shoe. It was a strange feeling. He heard a loud voice from the living room downstairs. It was Mr. White. The lawyer did not sound calm anymore. He sounded very angry and very afraid. Thomas left his room and walked down the stairs. The wood made a low, rubbing sound under his feet. The group was in the living room. Mrs. Gable was lighting more candles. Victor and Diana were standing near the fireplace. Mr. White was in the center of the room. He was looking at a small wooden table next to the sofa. His hands were shaking. "It is gone," Mr. White shouted. He looked at Victor with angry eyes. "You took it, didn't you? You wanted the legal papers." "I don't know what you are talking about," Victor said. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I have been here with Diana the whole time. We were looking at the paintings." "My briefcase," Mr. White said. He was sweating, and his face was very pale. "It was right here on this table. I only left it for 5 minutes to go to the kitchen for a glass of water. When I came back, it was gone. All the legal documents for the mansion are inside. The will of Uncle Henry is inside." Thomas looked at the table. It was empty. The heavy leather briefcase was gone. He remembered the note in his shoe. "Do not trust the lawyer." Was Mr. White lying? Maybe he hid the briefcase himself to make everyone else look guilty. Or maybe someone really did steal it in the dark. Maybe the housekeeper took it. Diana suggested. She looked at Mrs. Gable. She is the only one who knows every corner of this house. She moves like a shadow. She can move without making any noise. Mrs. Gable did not look at Diana. She continued to light the candles one by one. "I do not want your papers," she said quietly. "I want this storm to end. I want this house to be quiet again. Your papers mean nothing to me. We need to find that briefcase," Mr. White said. He looked at Thomas. "Thomas, you are Henry's family. You must help me. Those documents prove that the house belongs to you if something happens to Henry. Without those papers, Victor and Diana can try to take everything." Victor took a step toward the lawyer. "Don't try to use the boy, White. We know you want the safe. Maybe the missing briefcase is just a story you made up." The room felt very small. The orange light from the candles made everyone's faces look strange. The wind outside was still roaring. It felt like the house was under attack by the sand. Thomas did not know who to believe. He looked at the lawyer's eyes. They looked honest, but the note in his shoe told him to be careful. "I will help look for it," Thomas said. "But we should all stay together. It is not safe to walk alone in the dark." Suddenly, they heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was the sound of a heavy metal object hitting the stone floor in the basement below them. The sound was deep and hollow. Everyone became silent. They looked at the floorboards under their feet. "What was that?" Diana whispered. Her voice was very thin. The basement, Mrs. Gable said. She looked at the door near the kitchen. Someone is down there. Thomas looked at the narrow door near the kitchen. It was made of thick metal and had a heavy bolt. Mrs. Gable took a large iron key from her belt. She turned the key. She pushed the door open. A wave of very cold air came from the stairs. It did not smell like the dry desert. It smelled like wet stone and old metal. I will go first, Victor said. He took a large candle from the table. He wanted to show everyone that he was brave. They walked down the stone stairs one by one. The steps were very steep and narrow. Thomas held the cold wall with his left hand. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The basement was a large, open space with many thick stone pillars. There were many wooden boxes and old pieces of furniture covered in white sheets. In the candlelight, the sheets looked like ghosts standing in the dark. "Is anyone here?" Mr. White called out. His voice echoed against the distant walls. No one answered. The only sound was the low, constant roar of the wind above them. They moved slowly through the boxes. Thomas looked at the floor. The ground was made of smooth grey stone. Suddenly, his foot stepped on something soft. He stopped and moved his candle down. "Look at this," Thomas said. The group gathered around him. On the floor was a long, dark wool coat. It was a man's coat, very expensive and heavy. Thomas reached down and touched the fabric. He pulled his hand back quickly. "It is wet," Thomas whispered. "Wet?" Diana asked. She looked at the ceiling. "How can it be wet?" "It is a sandstorm outside. It has not rained in this desert for 6 months. There are no pipes in this part of the basement." Victor picked up the coat. He felt the sleeves. "It is not just a little damp. It is soaked. It feels like someone jumped into a pool of water and then dropped the coat here." Mr. White looked at the coat closely. "This belongs to Henry. I saw him wearing it 2 days ago. But where is the water coming from?" Mrs. Gable stood at the back of the group. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but Thomas saw her hands shaking. She was looking at a dark corner of the basement where the light did not reach. "The tunnels," she said in a very small voice. "What tunnels?" Thomas asked. He remembered the narrow passage he found behind the library. "There are old water tunnels under the house," Mrs. Gable explained. "They are very deep. Sometimes, when the wind is very strong, the sand pushes the deep water up. But no one goes down there. It is too dangerous." Thomas looked at the wet coat. If the coat was Henry's, and it was wet, it meant his uncle was in the water tunnels. But why would an old man go into a dark, wet hole in the middle of a sandstorm? He looked at the dark corner Mrs. Gable was watching. He felt that someone was standing there, just beyond the light of their candles. The group left the cold basement. They climbed the steep stone stairs and returned to the kitchen. Mrs. Gable locked the metal door behind them. Everyone was shivering from the cold air. The wet wool coat remained in Victor's hand. It was a heavy reminder that Uncle Henry was somewhere in the dark, wet parts of the house. "We need to eat," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was firm. "The storm is strong, and we are all tired. We cannot think if we are hungry." She led them to the dining room. She placed several candles on the long wooden table. The orange light jumped against the dark walls. She brought out a large pot of hot vegetable soup and some thick bread. The smell of the food was good, but no one felt happy. They sat in their chairs and began to eat in total silence. Thomas looked at the people around the table. Mr. White was staring at his soup. He looked like he was thinking about his missing briefcase. Victor was still holding the wet coat next to his chair. Diana was looking at the ceiling. Her face was pale in the candlelight. Every time the wind hit the house, she jumped. Suddenly, A new noise started. It was not the wind, and it was not the scratching of the sand against the glass. It was a rhythmic sound coming from the ceiling directly above the dining table. It was the sound of heavy feet hitting the wooden floor of the second story. Everyone stopped eating. Thomas held his spoon mid-air. They all looked up at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling. The sound moved slowly. It went from the left side of the room to the right side. The wood made a low, groaning noise under the weight of the footsteps. "Someone is up there," Victor whispered. He stood up so fast that his chair almost fell over. "But we are all here," Diana said. Her voice was trembling. She counted the people at the table. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the housekeeper is in the kitchen. That is 5. There should be no one else in the house. The footsteps stopped directly above Thomas. For a moment, the house was completely silent. Then, the sound started again, but faster this time. It sounded like someone was running toward the back of the house where the attic stairs were located. "It must be Henry," Mr. White shouted. He grabbed his candle. "He is out of the tunnels. He is upstairs." "Wait," Thomas called out. He remembered the note in his shoe. "Do not trust the lawyer. We should stay together. It could be a trap." But Victor and Mr. White were already running out of the dining room. They did not listen. They wanted the silver key and the briefcase. Diana followed them because she was afraid to be alone in the dark. Thomas looked at Mrs. Gable, who was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She was not moving. She was looking at the ceiling with a strange expression on her face. It was not fear. It looked like she was waiting for something to happen. Thomas took his candle and followed the others. He felt a heavy weight in his chest. The mystery was moving from the basement to the top of the house. He needed to find out who was walking above them before someone got hurt. Thomas ran up the wide wooden stairs. His heart was beating fast. The orange light from his candle moved across the walls. He reached the second floor. Victor, Diana, and Mr. White were standing in the middle of the long hallway. They were all looking up at the ceiling. In the center of the hallway, a small square door in the ceiling was open. A wooden ladder was now hanging down to the floor. The ladder was not here before. Mr. White whispered. He held his candle high. Someone pulled it down from the inside. "Henry is up there," Victor said. He looked at the ladder. It was old and the wood looked very dry. "He is hiding in the attic. He thinks he can escape from us. Or maybe it is not Henry," Diana said. She stayed close to the wall. Her face was full of fear. "Maybe it is the person who took the briefcase. Maybe it is the person who put the silver box in my room." Victor did not wait. He grabbed the sides of the ladder and began to climb. The wood made a sharp, high noise under his weight. He disappeared into the dark hole in the ceiling. Mr. White followed him quickly. He held his briefcase handle in one hand and the ladder with the other. He moved with a lot of energy. Thomas looked at Diana. "Are you coming?" "No," she said. She shook her head. "I will wait here. I do not like small, dark spaces. I will keep watch in the hallway." Thomas nodded and stepped toward the ladder. He put his candle on a small table nearby so he could use both hands. He began to climb. The air became much hotter as he moved higher. The attic was directly under the roof, and the heat from the desert day was still there. He could also hear the sandstorm much more clearly now. The sand hit the roof like millions of tiny stones. It was a very loud and constant noise. Thomas reached the top of the ladder. He pushed his body through the square hole. He was standing on a floor made of rough wooden planks. The attic was a very large room, but the ceiling was low. There were no windows. The only light came from the candles of Victor and Mr. White. They were already at the far end of the attic. The room was filled with old trunks, broken chairs, and tall stacks of newspapers. Large spider webs hung from the roof beams. Everything was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. Thomas looked at the floor. He saw fresh footprints in the dust. There were 2 sets of large footprints from Victor and Mr. White, but there was also a third set. These footprints were smaller and led toward a large wooden desk in the corner. "He was just here," Victor shouted. He was pointing at a small door at the back of the attic. "I saw a shadow move behind that door." Thomas walked toward them. He felt the dry dust in his throat. He looked at the footprints again. They did not look like the footprints of an old man. They looked fast and light. He realized that the mystery in the attic was just beginning. Thomas walked slowly across the attic. The floor made a low, protesting sound under his feet. He had to be careful because some of the wooden boards looked very thin. Victor and Mr. White were at the far end of the room. They were looking at a small wooden door near the roof. Victor tried to turn the handle, but it did not move. "It is locked from the other side," Victor shouted. He hit the door with his hand. The sound of the blow was dull and heavy. Thomas did not join them. He stayed near the center of the attic. He saw a small desk made of dark wood. It was tucked into a corner under a low beam. The desk was very old, and it had many small drawers. Thomas moved his candle closer. Most of the attic was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. However, the top of this desk was clean. Someone had wiped the dust away very recently. In the middle of the desk, there was a pair of reading glasses. Thomas recognized them immediately. They had thin gold frames and a small scratch on the left lens. They belonged to Uncle Henry. Thomas picked them up. They felt warm, as if someone had just been wearing them. "Look at this," Thomas called out to the others. Victor and Mr. White ran back to the desk. Their candles made the shadows of the attic jump and stretch. Victor looked at the glasses and then at the clean desk. "He was sitting here," Mr. White whispered. He looked around the dark room. "He was sitting here in the dark while we were downstairs. But why? What was he doing in the attic?" Thomas looked at the desk again. There was a small piece of blue velvet on the wood. It was the same color as the inside of the silver box Diana found in her room. Next to the velvet, there was a small, empty circle in the dust. Something round and heavy had been sitting there. The silver box. Thomas thought. He had the box here. Then he took it to Diana's room. "There is something else," Victor said. He pointed his flashlight at the floor under the desk. There was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Thomas reached down and picked it up. He opened it carefully. It was not a note. It was a drawing of a key. It was not just any key. It was a drawing of a key with a very complex shape. Under the drawing, there were some numbers. The 22nd of October, 14. What do those numbers mean? Victor asked. He tried to grab the paper, but Thomas put it in his pocket quickly. "I don't know," Thomas said. "Maybe it is a date. Or a code for a lock." Suddenly, the house shook. A very strong wind hit the side of the mansion. The sound of the sand against the roof became much louder. It sounded like a heavy rain, but it was dry and sharp. The air in the attic was full of the smell of old paper and hot dust. "We are wasting time," Victor said. He looked at the locked door at the back of the attic again. "If he is behind that door, I'm going to break it." Victor ran toward the door. He put his shoulder against the wood and pushed with all his strength. The door made a loud, cracking sound, but it stayed closed. Thomas looked at the reading glasses in his hand. He felt that Uncle Henry was playing a game with them. He was leading them through the house like characters in a book. Victor hit the door one last time. His face was red and covered in sweat. He was breathing very hard. It is no use," he shouted. The attic door was too strong. Mr. White looked at the reading glasses in Thomas's hand. He seemed very worried. "Let's go back down," Mr. White said. "It is too hot here. We need to think in a cooler room." They climbed down the wooden ladder. Thomas was the last one to leave the attic. He looked back at the dark, dusty room one more time. He still felt that someone was watching him from behind the old trunks. When he reached the hallway, he saw Diana waiting. She looked very nervous. Her hands were holding her yellow dress tightly. "Did you find him?" she asked. Her voice was thin. "No," Thomas said. "Just his glasses and a drawing." Suddenly, Thomas noticed something. Victor was not with them anymore. He looked at Mr. White and then at Diana. "Where is Victor?" "He was right behind us on the ladder." Mr. White looked around the dark hallway. The candles were getting low. "I do not know. Maybe he went to the kitchen for more water." He was very angry. Thomas felt a bad feeling in his stomach. He did not trust Victor. He walked toward the back of the house. He heard a different noise now. It was not the wind against the stone walls. It was the sound of a heavy metal bolt moving slowly. He ran to the mudroom near the back of the kitchen. This room had a very thick wooden door that led directly to the desert. He saw Victor there. Victor already had his heavy coat on. He was holding the large metal handle of the back door with both hands. He was trying to pull it open. "Victor! Stop!" Thomas shouted. "What are you doing? You cannot go out there. The storm is at its strongest point." Victor turned around. His eyes were wide and full of panic. "I cannot stay in this house another minute, Thomas. There are ghosts, secret tunnels, and missing people. I don't care about the money or the contract anymore. I just want to leave this place. The sand will kill you in minutes," Thomas said. He stepped forward to stop him. "You will get lost in 10 seconds. You won't even find your car." Victor did not listen. He pulled the handle with all his strength. The door opened only a few inches. Immediately, a giant wave of hot, orange sand rushed into the room. The wind was so strong that it pushed Victor back against the stone wall. The air in the mudroom became thick with dust. It was very hard to breathe. Thomas felt the sand hit his face like thousands of tiny, sharp needles. The desert outside was a wall of orange chaos. Victor tried to push the door shut, but the wind was like a giant hand pushing back. Thomas ran to help him. They both put their shoulders against the heavy wood. They pushed with all their strength. The sand was everywhere, in their eyes, in their hair, and on the floor. Finally, the door clicked shut. The metal bolt moved back into place. Victor fell to the floor, coughing and shaking. "I told you," Thomas said. He was also coughing from the dust. "No one can leave the mansion until the storm stops. We are trapped here together." Victor stayed on the floor. He looked at his hands. They were covered in orange dust. He looked defeated. Thomas looked at the door. He realized that the house was a mystery, but the outside was certain death. Thomas helped Victor stand up. Victor was shaking. His expensive coat was now orange because of the sand. They walked slowly back to the living room. Mr. White and Diana were waiting there. They looked at the sand on the floor and the dust on the two men. The air in the house now tasted like earth. "You are a fool, Victor," Diana said. She did not help him. She sat on the sofa and looked at her long fingernails. "No one can survive out there. You should know that. The desert does not have mercy." Victor sat in a chair and put his head in his hands. He did not say anything. He was too tired to argue. Thomas looked at Diana. She was very calm. but her eyes were sharp. She seemed more interested in the house than in Victor's safety. "Why are you really here, Diana?" Thomas asked. He stood in front of her. "Yesterday, you said you were Henry's partner. You said he owed you money. But you don't look like a partner. You look like you hate him." Diana looked up at Thomas. She gave a small, cold smile. She reached into her small bag and took out a cigarette, but she did not light it. "You are a smart boy, Thomas. Much smarter than Victor. You are right. I was not Henry's partner. Not really." Mr. White moved closer. He looked surprised. "What do you mean, Diana?" "The documents in my office say you worked together on the mining project." "We worked together because I wanted to destroy him," Diana said. Her voice was very quiet and very cold. "Henry was my rival. 30 years ago, we both wanted the same land in the desert. He won because he found the silver key first. He found the gold, and I lost everything. My family's company went away because of your uncle." The room became very silent. Even the wind outside seemed to listen. Thomas felt the weight of the old secrets. He remembered the photo from 1985. "So, you came here for revenge?" Thomas asked. "I came here for what is mine," Diana replied. "Henry stole my future. He took the riches that belonged to my family. He spent years hiding in this mansion, but I never forgot. I followed him here to take the silver key. If I have the key, I have the power. I don't care about a business contract. I want to see Henry lose everything, just like I did." "Does Victor know this?" Thomas asked, looking at the man in the chair. Victor looked up. His eyes were red. "I knew she hated him," Victor whispered. "But I didn't know she wanted to destroy him. I just wanted the money." Thomas felt a cold shiver. He was in a house with a man who wanted money and a woman who wanted revenge. And his uncle was still missing. He looked at Mr. White. The lawyer was looking at Diana with a strange expression. He did not look angry. He looked interested. Thomas touched the note in his shoe. He realized that the danger was growing every hour. Thomas left the living room. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and the orange dust that had entered through the back door. He felt the weight of the drawing in his pocket. The numbers. The 22nd of October, 14, seemed to burn against his leg. He knew he had to find where they belonged before Diana or Victor found him. He returned to Uncle Henry's study. The door was still broken, hanging slightly off its hinges. The room was dark, but the moonlight, pale and filtered through the sand-clogged windows, gave the bookshelves a ghostly appearance. Thomas lit a fresh candle. He looked at the vast wall of books. 10, 22, 14. He whispered. He thought about the library. Could it be a coordinate for a book? He started counting the shelves from the floor. Shelf 10. He moved his finger across the leather spines. Book 22. It was a thick, black volume with no title on the spine. He pulled it out. It was heavy, but when he opened it, his heart sank. The pages had been cut out. The book was a hollow shell. Inside, there was nothing but a small, rusted metal dial. "It's a combination," a voice said from the shadows. Thomas jumped, nearly dropping his candle. Mr. White was standing by the broken door. The lawyer's face was half hidden in shadow, making his eyes look like dark pits. He held his hands behind his back. Thomas remembered the note. "Do not trust the lawyer. I saw you leave the room, Thomas," Mr. White said, stepping into the light. "I thought you might need help. You found the dial, I see. Henry always loved puzzles. What does it open?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "There is a safe," Mr. White said. pointing to a large painting of a desert oasis on the far wall. "Henry told me about it once. He said the contents were for his heir. That would be you, Thomas. But the combination was lost. Or so I thought." Thomas looked at the painting. He walked over and pushed it aside. Behind it was a circular steel door, cold and grey. In the center was a hole where the dial from the hollow book would fit perfectly. "The numbers you found?" Mr. White prompted, his voice smooth as oil. 10, 22, 14. They are the combination, aren't they? Thomas hesitated. If he opened the safe, would Mr. White take what was inside? He looked at the lawyer's expensive suit, now dusty and worn. He saw the way Mr. White's eyes moved toward the safe, not with worry for Henry, but with hunger. "I don't know the numbers." Thomas lied. "I just found the book." Mr. White's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas, we are in a dangerous situation. The storm is getting worse. If your uncle is gone, we need to secure his legacy. Give me the dial." He stepped closer. Thomas backed away, his hand tightening around the metal dial in his pocket. Suddenly, a loud blow came from the floor above them, followed by the sound of glass breaking. A scream echoed through the house. It was Diana. Thomas didn't wait for Mr. White to answer. He shoved the metal dial deep into his pocket and ran out of the study. The scream had been sharp and full of genuine terror. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his candle flame dancing wildly and nearly dying out. He reached the second-floor hallway and found Diana slumped against the wall, her hands over her eyes. Victor was standing near her, holding a heavy brass lamp like a club. At the end of the hallway, the large ornamental window had shattered. The desert was no longer outside. It was pouring into the house. A fierce, howling wind whipped through the corridor, carrying a thick curtain of orange sand. It tasted like salt and ancient dust. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched whistle that made Thomas's ears ache. "What happened?" Thomas shouted over the roar of the wind. "I saw him!" Diana cried, her voice cracking. She pointed a trembling finger at the jagged hole where the glass used to be. "I was walking to my room, and I heard a tapping. I looked at the window, and there was a face. A man was standing on the narrow ledge outside." "That's impossible," Mr. White said as he reached the top of the stairs, breathing heavily. "No one could stand out there in this wind. They would be blown into the dunes in a second." "I know what I saw," Diana screamed. It was a man with a pale face and dark eyes. He was staring right at me. Then the glass just exploded. Victor stepped toward the broken window, squinting against the stinging sand. "There's no one there now." He grunted, though he didn't go too close to the edge. The wind was strong enough to knock a person over. Thomas looked at the floor. Amidst the shards of glass and the growing piles of sand, he saw something dark. He knelt down, shielding his eyes. It was a piece of black fabric, torn and wet, caught on a sharp piece of the window frame. He pulled it free. It felt like the same heavy wool as the coat they had found in the basement. "Was it Uncle Henry?" Thomas asked, looking at Diana. "I don't know," she wailed. "It was too dark, too fast. It just looked like a ghost. We have to block this," Mr. White commanded, regaining his professional tone. "If we don't, the pressure will rip the doors off their hinges. Victor, help me with that heavy rug from the guest room. Thomas, find some tape or rope in the linen closet." For the next 10 minutes, they fought the storm. It was a desperate struggle. They dragged a thick, Persian rug over the opening and hammered it into the wooden frame using the base of the brass lamp and some heavy nails Victor found in a nearby toolkit. Every time the wind gusted, the rug bulged inward like a giant lung, but it held. When they finally finished, they were all covered in a fine layer of grit. Thomas looked at the others. Their faces were masks of exhaustion and suspicion. He felt the metal dial in his pocket. If someone was outside, the house wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a target. "We need to stay together," Thomas said firmly. "No more wandering off. We go to the living room, and we stay there until the sun comes up." As they began to walk back downstairs, Thomas looked back at the covered window. He couldn't shake the image of a face in the sand. If his uncle was outside, he was surely dying. But if it wasn't his uncle, who was trying to get in? The four of them sat in the living room, surrounded by the flickering ghosts of candlelight. The air was gritty, and every breath felt like swallowing dry earth. Mrs. Gable appeared from the kitchen with a tray of heavy ceramic mugs filled with a dark, bitter tea. She moved with a strange, fluid grace that seemed unaffected by the chaos of the night. "Drink this," she said, her voice a low rasp. "It will keep you warm. The desert takes the heat from your bones when the sun is gone." Thomas took a mug, but he didn't drink. He was watching Mr. White. The lawyer was sitting near the fireplace, though no fire was lit. He was rubbing his hands together nervously. Thomas noticed something he hadn't seen before. As the lawyer reached for his tea, the light from a nearby candle caught a glimmer on his right hand. Thomas felt his breath hitch. On Mr. White's ring finger was a heavy gold band. Set into the gold was a large, polished black stone that seemed to swallow the candlelight. It was the ring from the torn photograph. "You were there," Thomas whispered, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. Mr. White stopped moving. He looked at Thomas, his eyes narrowing. "What was that, Thomas?" "The photo I found in the kitchen," Thomas said, standing up. He pulled the yellowed, torn picture from his pocket and slapped it onto the coffee table. 1985, the beginning of the end. "That's your hand on my uncle's shoulder, isn't it? You wore that ring 30 years ago, and you're wearing it now." Victor and Diana leaned forward, their eyes darting between the photo and the lawyer's hand. "White?" Victor asked, his voice dangerous. "You told us you only started working for Henry 10 years ago. You said you were just a city lawyer." Mr. White didn't panic. He slowly took a sip of his tea and set the mug down with a deliberate motion. "A man is allowed to have a history, Thomas. And a man is allowed to wear a ring. You lied about how long you've known him." Thomas pressed. "Why? What happened in 1985? Diana mentioned a fire. Was that the night the photo was taken?" Mr. White sighed, a long, weary sound. 1985 was a year of great ambition and great mistakes. Your uncle and I were partners in a sense. We found something in the desert. Something more valuable than gold. But greed is a poison, Thomas. It turned a friendship into a rivalry. The fire Diana speaks of was an accident, but it destroyed the evidence of our discovery. "And the silver key?" Diana demanded, her voice sharp. "If you were there at the beginning, you know what it opens." "I know what it is supposed to open," Mr. White corrected. "But Henry changed the locks. He grew paranoid. He thought I wanted to steal his share. He fled to this house and built a fortress of secrets." Suddenly, the front door, the massive, reinforced oak door, shook under a violent blow. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, heavy pounding. "Who is that?" Diana shrieked, jumping to her feet. "It's the man from the window." Victor growled, picking up his brass lamp again. "He's come for the key." Thomas looked at the door, then at the lawyer, then at the secret dial in his own pocket. He realized that the ghost outside might not be a stranger at all. It might be the only person who knew the whole truth. The pounding on the door stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that made the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sound like a hammer. Victor held the brass lamp high, his knuckles white. Diana backed away into the kitchen doorway, while Mr. White stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the massive oak barrier. Then, the heavy iron bolt on the door began to slide. "It's opening from the outside." Diana shrieked. "That's impossible." Mr. White whispered, his voice trembling. "The only people with a key are Henry and—" He didn't finish. With a violent crack, the door flew open. A wall of orange sand and freezing desert air exploded into the living room, extinguishing half the candles instantly. In the swirling chaos of the storm, a tall, thin silhouette stood framed against the darkness. The figure stepped forward, stumbling as the wind pushed him into the house. He was covered from head to toe in fine orange dust, making him look like a statue come to life. His clothes were torn, and he was shivering so violently. It was Uncle Henry. "Uncle!" Thomas cried out, rushing forward. He caught the old man just before he collapsed onto the marble floor. Henry's skin was like ice. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting around the room with a mixture of terror and madness. He clutched something tightly in his right hand, a small object wrapped in a piece of wet, black wool. "Close, the door." Henry gasped, his voice a dry rattle. "Before he gets in." Victor and Mr. White slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The roar of the storm was muffled once more, but the tension in the room remained at a breaking point. Mrs. Gable appeared with a thick wool blanket, wrapping it around Henry as Thomas helped him into a chair near the cold fireplace. "Henry, where have you been?" Mr. White asked, leaning over him. The lawyer's face was a mask of concern, but Thomas noticed his eyes were fixed on the object in Henry's hand. "We thought you were lost in the tunnels." Henry didn't look at the lawyer. He looked at Thomas. He slowly reached out and unrolled the black fabric. Resting in his palm was a long, thin key made of shimmering, untarnished silver. Its head was shaped like a desert lily, intricate and beautiful. "The silver key," Diana whispered, her eyes wide with greed. Henry's hand shook as he held the key toward Thomas. "They think it's about the gold," he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They think it's about the money. But they don't know what I saw in 1985. They don't know what we found under the sands." He suddenly turned his head and stared directly at Mr. White. "You shouldn't have come back, Arthur," Henry said, using the lawyer's first name for the first time. "The secret doesn't belong to you. It never did." Mr. White took a step back, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. Before he could respond, Henry's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped forward, unconscious. The silver key slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a clear, musical ring. Everyone stared at the key. In that moment, Thomas realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break inside the house. The silver key lay on the floor, glowing with a cold, pale light that seemed to defy the darkness of the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and greed. Then, like a spring being released, Victor and Mr. White both lunged forward. But Thomas was faster. He dropped to his knees, his fingers closing over the cool, etched metal just inches before Victor's hand reached it. He stood up quickly, thrusting the key into his pocket alongside the metal dial and the drawing. "Give it to me, Thomas," Mr. White said. His voice was no longer smooth, it was jagged and desperate. "You don't understand what you're holding. It's dangerous. I can keep it safe. Like you kept my uncle safe in 1985. Thomas countered, stepping back toward the stairs. "You've lied to me since the moment I arrived. I'm not giving this to anyone until my uncle wakes up and tells me the truth." "We don't have time for him to wake up," Diana snapped. She was trembling, her eyes fixed on the pocket where the key was hidden. The storm is tearing this house apart. If that key opens a way out, or a way to the treasure, we need to use it now. Mrs. Gable stepped between Thomas and the others. She looked like a shadow come to life, her eyes flashing in the candlelight. Mr. Henry needs rest, she said firmly. Victor, help me carry him to the guest suite. Now. Victor hesitated, glancing at the key in Thomas's pocket, then at the unconscious old man. With a grunt of frustration, he grabbed Henry's legs while Mrs. Gable took his shoulders. They carried him out of the room, leaving Thomas alone with Mr. White and Diana. You think you're the hero, don't you? Mr. White said, his voice dropping to a low hiss. He stepped into Thomas's personal space. The black stone on his ring seemed to pulse. Henry isn't the man you think he is. He didn't build this house to protect himself. He built it to hide the crime we committed together. That key doesn't just open a safe, Thomas. It opens a grave. I don't believe you, Thomas said, though his heart was racing. Then look at the numbers again. Mr. White whispered. The 22nd of October, 14. They aren't just a combination. They are a date. October 22nd, 2014, the day the third partner disappeared. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. He turned and ran toward the study. He had the dial. He had the key. He had the numbers. He needed to know what was behind that steel door before the lawyer could stop him. He burst into the study and slammed the heavy oak door, shoving a chair under the handle. He ran to the painting and pushed it aside. With trembling hands, he pulled the metal dial from his pocket and pressed it into the center of the safe door. It clicked into place perfectly. 10, 22, 14. He turned the dial with a series of heavy, metallic thuds. On the final number, a deep vibration shook the wall. The safe door didn't swing open. Instead, the entire wall behind the bookshelves began to recede, revealing a staircase that went much deeper than the basement. Thomas stood at the edge of the descent. From the darkness below, he heard the sound of rushing water and the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock that shouldn't exist. Thomas descended the spiral stone stairs, his hand gripping the cold, damp wall. The air grew heavier with every step, smelling of wet iron and ancient earth. The ticking sound he had heard from above was now a rhythmic, mechanical thud that vibrated through his boots. It wasn't a clock, it was a heartbeat. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a massive, circular chamber. The walls were lined with copper pipes and hissing brass valves. In the center of the room stood a complex machine made of shimmering gears and dark steel. It was powered by the rushing water of the underground tunnels, the force of the desert's hidden rivers turning a giant water wheel. It's an aquifer regulator. A voice echoed from the shadows of the stairs. Thomas spun around, raising his candle. Mr. White was standing at the entrance of the chamber. He had pushed past the chair in the study. His face was twisted with a mixture of awe and fury. Behind him, Diana stepped into the light, her eyes reflecting the gleam of the copper pipes. Henry didn't find gold, Mr. White said, walking toward the machine. He found the source. This machine controls the water flow for the entire region. In the middle of the desert, water is more valuable than any bank vault full of gold. He's been selling the rights for decades, hiding the profits in offshore accounts. But what happened in 2014? Thomas asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. What about the third partner? Mr. White stopped. He looked at a small iron-bound door at the back of the chamber. It was sealed with a heavy lock that bore the mark of a desert lily. Sarah. Diana whispered, her voice surprisingly soft. She was the engineer. She built this. But she wanted to give the water back to the people, to turn the desert green. Henry and Arthur. Mr. White wanted the money. On October 22nd, 2014, there was an accident during a storm just like this one. She was trapped on the other side of that door when the tunnels flooded. Thomas looked at the silver key in his hand. The head of the key was the lily, Sarah's symbol. Henry didn't kill her. Mr. White snapped, though he didn't look Thomas in the eye. He just didn't open the door in time. He's spent the last 12 years down here, obsessed with this machine, trying to find a way to undo what he did. He kept the silver key as a penance, or a trophy. I never knew which. And now you want the key to take control of the water. Thomas said, realization dawning on him. That's why you're here. To finish what you started in 1985. Give it to me, Thomas. Mr. White commanded. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, sleek pistol. The black stone on his ring glinted like a predator's eye. The storm outside is going to breach the upper levees. If someone doesn't use that key to engage the emergency bypass, this whole house, and everyone in it, will be swallowed by the sinkhole. The ticking of the machine grew faster, more urgent. The floor beneath them began to tilt. A spray of cold water erupted from a cracked pipe, drenching Thomas. He looked at the iron door, then at the machine, then at the man holding the gun. You're lying, Thomas said, his voice steady. If I give you the key, you'll leave us all here to drown. I don't have time for your morality. Mr. White yelled, the gun shaking in his hand. Suddenly, a heavy splash sounded from the water tunnels below. A dark shape pulled itself out of the churning water. It was Victor, his face bruised and his clothes soaking wet. He was holding the leather briefcase. I found it, Victor shouted, gasping for air. I found the real contract. White. It wasn't in the safe. It was hidden in the overflow pipe. The water was no longer just a spray. It was a rising tide. It poured from the vents, cold and relentless, swirling around their ankles. Victor scrambled away from the edge of the metal platform, clutching the soaked leather briefcase to his chest. Mr. White's focus fractured. The gun in his hand wavered between Thomas and the briefcase. The greed for the contract was fighting his desperate need for the machine's control. The contract proves White was the one who locked the door. Victor yelled, his voice echoing off the damp stone. It's all here. The payoffs, the forged signatures, everything. He didn't just want the water. He wanted to erase Sarah. Mr. White roared in frustration and fired a shot into the air. The sound was deafening in the circular chamber, a sharp crack that was followed by the sound of falling dust and stone. Shut up. Both of you. White screamed. Thomas, the key. Use it on the bypass or we all drown in this hole. Thomas looked at the machine. He saw the lily-shaped lock near the main pressure gauge. He knew that if he turned it, the water would be diverted back into the deep desert aquifers, stopping the flood and saving the mansion. But doing so would engage the system Mr. White needed to control the region's most precious resource. Suddenly, the iron-bound door at the back of the chamber, the one Diana had claimed was a tomb, began to shake. It wasn't the pressure of the water. It was a rhythmic, mechanical clanking, as if someone on the other side was throwing a series of heavy levers. It can't be, Diana whispered, her eyes wide with terror. No one has been in there for 12 years. The door groaned, the rusted hinges screaming, and then it swung open. A figure stood in the threshold, drenched and pale, but standing with a terrifying stillness. It wasn't a ghost. It was Mrs. Gable, but she had shed her housekeeper's persona. She was wearing a heavy, waterproof diving suit, and her hair was pulled back tightly. In her hand, she held a long iron wrench. The bypass won't work from there, Thomas. She shouted over the roar of the rising water. Her voice was no longer flat. It was strong and commanding. "The gears are jammed with sand from the storm. You have to use the key in the manual override, inside the secondary chamber." "Sarah." Mr. White gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of white. The gun dropped to his side. "Sarah died in 2014. Arthur." Mrs. Gable said, stepping into the main chamber. The water reached her knees. But she didn't flinch. "I am her sister, Elena. I took this job to find out the truth. I've been maintaining this machine in secret while Henry hid in his guilt. I've been waiting 12 years for you to come back to this room so I could show you exactly what it feels like to be trapped." She looked at Thomas, her expression softening for a split second. "Thomas, the key. The override is behind the main gear assembly. If you don't turn it now, the pressure will blow the foundation of the house." The water was now a churning, violent force, rising to their waists. The roar of the underground river was so loud that Thomas had to scream to be heard. "Elena, where is the override?" "Behind the central axle." Elena shouted, gesturing with her wrench toward the heart of the massive machine. "There is a small panel with the lily crest. You must turn it clockwise, or the pressure will burst the floor." Mr. White, snapped out of his shock by the icy water, raised his gun again. His eyes were wild. "No. If you turn that, the bypass will dump the reservoir into the salt flats. Millions of dollars will be lost. Lives are worth more than your reservoir, Arthur." Elena cried. She lunged through the water, swinging her heavy wrench. She didn't hit him, but the sheer force of her movement splashed a wave of freezing water into White's face. He stumbled back, his gun firing a stray shot that sparked harmlessly against a copper pipe. Thomas didn't wait. He threw himself toward the gear assembly. The metal was slick with oil and water. He climbed onto a vibrating steel platform, his boots slipping on the wet surface. Above him, the giant water wheel groaned, its wooden slats snapping under the immense pressure of the flood. He found it. Tucked behind a vibrating brass piston was a small, circular panel. It was etched with the same desert lily he had seen on the key and the door. Thomas pulled the silver key from his pocket. The silver metal seemed to pulse with a faint, warm light in the damp darkness. "Thomas, don't!" Mr. White yelled from below, struggling to keep his head above the rising tide. "Think of the future. Think of the power." Thomas ignored him. He jammed the silver key into the lock. It fit perfectly, a silent marriage of metal and history. He took a deep breath, braced his feet against the vibrating frame, and turned the key. At first, nothing happened. The machine continued its frantic, killing rhythm. Then, a deep, resonant vibration pulsed through the key and into Thomas's arms. The gears slowed. A series of heavy iron shutters began to slide deep within the pipes, redirected by the manual override. The sound changed from a high-pitched scream to a low, melodic hum. Suddenly, the water stopped rising. For a moment, everything was frozen. Then, with a sound like a giant bathtub draining, the water began to recede. It was sucked back into the secondary drainage pipes Elena had maintained for a decade. Thomas stayed on the platform, gasping for air, his hand still on the silver key. Below him, the chamber was a mess of silt, debris, and broken dreams. Victor sat in the mud, still clutching the briefcase. Diana was shivering, leaning against a pillar. Mr. White had dropped his gun. It was lost somewhere in the receding sludge. He stood defeated, his expensive suit ruined, looking up at the boy who had just dismantled his empire. Elena stood in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the iron-bound door. The house was safe. The storm above was finally beginning to fade, the scratching of the sand against the stone walls slowing to a whisper. "It's over," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He pulled the silver key out of the lock. He felt older than he had 24 hours ago. He had found the treasure, but it wasn't gold. It was the truth. The sun rose over the desert with a brilliance that made the horrors of the night feel like a fading dream. The sand, once a violent wall of orange, now lay in soft, peaceful ripples across the dunes. The sky was a clear, pale blue, scrubbed clean by the wind. Inside the mansion, the air was still, though a layer of fine dust covered everything like a shroud. Thomas stood on the front porch, watching as two white vehicles with the local sheriff's emblems kicked up plumes of dust in the distance. They were coming for Arthur White. The lawyer sat on a stone bench in the hallway, his hands zip-tied by Victor, who had found a sudden sense of justice once he realized his own name wasn't on the forged contracts. Diana stood by her red car, shaking sand out of her silk scarf. She looked at the house one last time, not with greed, but with a strange kind of respect. She had lost her revenge, but she had gained her life. Without a word to anyone, she got into her car and drove toward the city, leaving the secrets of 1985 behind. Uncle Henry was awake, sitting in a large armchair brought out to the porch. He looked frail, but his eyes were clear. Elena, the woman Thomas had known only as Mrs. Gable, stood beside him. She was no longer a shadow. She was a guardian. "I can never make it right, Elena," Henry whispered, looking out at the horizon. "What I did to Sarah, what I allowed Arthur to do, it's a weight I'll carry until the end. The water is flowing to the valley now, Henry." Elena replied, her voice steady. "The secret is out. The people will have their green fields. That was Sarah's dream. That is your penance." Henry nodded slowly, then looked at Thomas. He reached out a trembling hand and patted Thomas's arm. "You did well, boy. You didn't just find the key. You found the courage to use it for the right reasons. This house, it's yours now. Or it will be. But don't stay here. Go back to the world. Don't let the desert swallow you like it did me." Thomas felt the weight of the silver key in his pocket. He pulled it out, the metal warm from the morning sun. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked at the lily-shaped head of the key. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, a symbol of both a crime and a salvation. "I'll make sure the machine is managed by the university," Thomas said. "It won't be a secret anymore. It'll be a legacy." As the sheriff's deputies led Mr. White away, the lawyer stopped and looked at Thomas. For a moment, the mask of the professional dropped, and Thomas saw only a broken, elderly man. White said nothing, but his gaze fell on the silver key one last time before he was ushered into the back of the vehicle. Thomas walked down the steps to his own car. He opened the door and tossed his dusty jacket into the passenger seat. He looked back at the mansion, the house of shadows, the house of water, the house of the silver key. It no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a monument to the truth. He started the engine and began the long drive back toward the city. In the rearview mirror, he saw the mansion growing smaller against the vast, golden desert. He reached into his pocket and touched the cold silver metal one last time. The mystery was solved, the debt was paid, and for the first time in his life, Thomas knew exactly who he was. Thomas returned to his apartment in the city 3 days after the storm. The transition was jarring. Instead of the howling wind and the smell of ancient dust, there was the constant hum of traffic and the neon glow of digital billboards. He sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the silver key. It looked out of place against the formica surface, like an artifact from another dimension. His phone had not stopped ringing. Journalists, lawyers from the State Water Board, and representatives from environmental groups all wanted a piece of the story. The mansion in the sand was headline news, but Thomas felt a lingering sense of unease. He kept thinking about the look on Mr. White's face when he was led away. It wasn't just the look of a defeated man, it was the look of someone who knew the bigger picture. That evening, a heavy package arrived via courier. It was from Victor. Inside was the leather briefcase, cleaned of most of the silt but still smelling faintly of the underground chamber. A note was attached. "Thomas, I'm heading to South America. I want no part of what's left. I found a double lining in this thing. I think you should be the one to see what's inside. Stay safe. Victor. Thomas ran his fingers along the inner seam of the briefcase. He felt a slight bump. Using a small pocket knife, he carefully sliced through the leather. Tucked inside was a slim, black ledger and a set of coordinates written on a piece of waterproof vellum. The ledger belonged to Sarah, the lost engineer. As Thomas flipped through the pages, he realized that the machine under the mansion was only a pump house. Sarah's notes described a much larger structure, the source, located 60 miles deeper into the forbidden zone of the desert. She called it the Oasis of Echoes. The water isn't just a reservoir. Thomas read aloud, his voice trembling. It's an ancient pressure system. If the regulator at the mansion is the heart, the source is the brain. If one is tampered with without the other, the entire crust of the valley could collapse. A shadow crossed his window. Thomas froze. He lived on the 12th floor, yet he distinctly heard the sound of something tapping against the glass. It was a rhythmic, metallic sound. He stood up and walked slowly toward the window. The city lights were bright, but as he pulled back the curtain, he saw a small, silver bird, a mechanical drone, hovering just outside. It had a camera lens that glowed with a soft, blue light. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the media. This was corporate surveillance. The battle for the desert's water wasn't over. It had just moved from the stone walls of the mansion to the glass towers of the city. Thomas realized that the silver key was still the most dangerous object in the state. Thomas backed away from the window, pulling the heavy curtains shut. The blue glow of the drone's camera faded, but he could still hear the faint buzz of its rotors. He realized he couldn't stay in the apartment. If they were watching him, it was only a matter of time before they moved from surveillance to confrontation. He packed a small bag with the essentials: the silver key, Sarah's ledger, the coordinates, and the old photo from 1985. Just as he reached for his jacket, a soft knock came at his door. Not the aggressive pounding of the police, but a rhythmic, melodic sequence. 3 fast, 2 slow. He peered through the peephole. Standing in the hallway was a woman he didn't recognize. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing a dark utility jacket and heavy boots. She looked exhausted, her face streaked with the same fine orange dust that Thomas had spent days scrubbing off his own skin. Thomas cracked the door open, keeping the security chain in place. "Who are you?" "My name is Maya," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the elevators. "I was Sarah's apprentice before the accident in 2014. Elena, the woman you know as Mrs. Gable, sent me. She said the lawyer wasn't the only one Henry was afraid of." Thomas hesitated, then unlatched the chain. Maya slipped inside, her eyes immediately finding the briefcase on the table. "You found the ledger," she said, a look of relief crossing her face. "Thank God. The Aura Water Corporation has been tracking that briefcase for years." "Aura Water?" Thomas asked. The company Mr. White mentioned. They funded the original expedition in '85. Maya explained, pacing the small kitchen. "They don't just want to sell the water, Thomas. They want to weaponize the scarcity. If they control the source, they control the lifeblood of 3 states. They have a private security force already moving toward the forbidden zone." She spread a map out on the table. It was a topographical map of the desert, but it was marked with strange symbols, geological anomalies that didn't appear on any public map. Henry kept them at bay because he had the key and the regulator. Maya continued. "But now that the mansion is in state hands and the secret is out, Aura Water is going to move fast to seize the source before the government can protect it. We have to get to the Oasis of Echoes tonight." "Tonight?" Thomas looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The storm just ended. The dunes will be shifting. It's suicide. It's the only way. Maya insisted. They think you're still processing the trauma of the mansion. They don't think you'll move this soon. We have a 4-hour head start. Thomas looked at the silver key. He thought of Sarah, trapped in the dark for 12 years of lies. He thought of the Oasis of Echoes and the responsibility his uncle had passed to him. I have a truck in the garage, Thomas said, his voice firm. But you're driving. I'm still seeing orange sand every time I close my eyes. As they slipped out the back exit of the building, the silver drone hovered above the roof, its blue eye tracking their every move. The second phase of the mystery had begun. The city lights faded into a blurry smear in the rearview mirror as Maya pushed the truck onto the dark ribbon of Highway 9. The transition from the urban sprawl to the emptiness of the desert was abrupt. One moment there were streetlights and gas stations. The next, there was only the vast, hungry dark of the wasteland. Thomas sat in the passenger seat, his fingers tracing the edges of the silver key. He felt like a man suspended between two lives. You said Sarah was an engineer, Thomas said, breaking the silence. But what exactly were the echoes she was studying? Uncle Henry mentioned them at the end, and the machine in the basement was so much more than a pump. Maya kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands steady on the wheel. Sarah believed that water carries memory. She explained. Not in a mystical way, but in a physical one. The way the water moves through the deep underground aquifers creates specific acoustic frequencies. She called them the Earth's pulse. By mapping these sounds, she could find where the water was most pressurized, where the veins of the desert were strongest. So the Oasis of Echoes isn't just a place where there's water. Thomas realized. It's a place where the sound is loudest. Exactly. Maya nodded. It's a natural amphitheater hidden deep within the forbidden zone. But Sarah didn't just want to listen. She developed a way to use those frequencies to stabilize the ground. If you know the right frequency, you can prevent sinkholes. Or, if you're aura water, you can create them. The implications were chilling. If a corporation controlled the ability to literally undermine the earth beneath their competitors or rebellious towns, they wouldn't just be a utility company, they would be gods of the terrain. Suddenly, the truck's dashboard flickered. The radio hissed with static, and the GPS screen turned a solid, blinding white. A high-pitched whine began to vibrate through the floorboards. They're jamming us. Maya grunted, fighting the steering wheel as the power steering began to fail. Thomas looked out the side window. High above, silhouetted against the pale moon, were 3 silver drones, much larger than the one from the apartment. They moved in a perfect triangle formation, keeping pace with the truck. They weren't just watching anymore. They were deploying an electromagnetic pulse to disable the vehicle. Hold on! Maya shouted. She yanked the wheel to the right, steering the truck off the paved road and into the rough, sandy shoulder. The tires kicked up a massive cloud of dust. She killed the headlights and navigated by the dim moonlight, driving deeper into the scrubland to break the line of sight. The truck jolted violently as it hit a hidden ditch, throwing Thomas against the door. The engine sputtered and died. Silence rushed back into the cab, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. Above them, the drones circled for a moment, their blue lights searching the dust cloud, before banking away toward the horizon. They lost us, Thomas whispered, his heart hammering. For now, Maya replied, reaching for a flashlight. But we're on foot from here. We have to reach the Red Rock outpost before dawn. Red Rock was once a thriving mining hub in the early 1900s, but now it was nothing more than a collection of skeletal buildings and rusted machinery half buried in the sand. As Thomas and Maya walked through the deserted main street, the wind whistled through empty window frames like a chorus of ghosts. Every step they took on the dry earth felt like an intrusion on a long-forgotten grave. This was the last place Sarah was seen before she went to the mansion. Maya said, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She kept a secondary log here, hidden in the old post office. She didn't trust the digital systems at the Aura Water Labs, so she went back to paper and ink. They reached a leaning wooden structure with a faded sign that read U.S. Post Office. The door was gone, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of fine silt. Thomas looked at the rows of brass mailboxes, many of them hanging open like thirsty mouths. Box 10 to 22. Thomas said, remembering the numbers from the drawing. It has to be. He walked to the back of the room. The brass plates were tarnished, but he found the row. Box 1022 was locked. He looked at the silver key, then at the small, standard keyhole. The silver key was far too large. He felt a moment of frustration. Was every clue going to be another dead end? Wait. Maya said, kneeling by the base of the mailbox unit. Look at the dust pattern. She blew gently on the floor. Beneath the silt was a small, circular indentation, exactly the size of the dial Thomas had used in the mansion study. The dial. Thomas whispered. He pulled the metal dial from his pocket. He didn't have the safe door here, but he realized the dial itself was a key. He pressed it against the indentation and turned it. The 22nd of October, 14. With a soft click, the entire back panel of the mailbox unit swung open. It wasn't a mailbox. It was a hidden compartment designed by someone who understood mechanical locks perfectly. Inside was a small, leather-bound satchel. Thomas opened the satchel. Inside was a hand-drawn map on translucent paper and a small, glass vial containing a strange, iridescent blue liquid. What is that? Thomas asked, holding the vial up to the flashlight. Aquifer tracer. Maya said, her eyes wide. It's a chemical marker that Sarah developed. If you pour this into the water at the source, it lights up the entire underground network. It shows every pipe, every leak, every secret tunnel for miles. It's the blueprint of the desert's heart. A loud metallic sound echoed from the street outside. Thomas and Maya froze. Through the open doorway, they saw the silhouettes of 3 men in tactical gear. They carried high-powered rifles and wore headsets. On their shoulders was a logo, a stylized blue wave inside a circle. Aura Water Security. They found the truck. A voice crackled over a radio. The boy and the girl are nearby. Move in. Sector 4 is clear. Check the post office. Thomas looked at Maya. There was nowhere to run. The back of the post office was a solid stone wall. He gripped the satchel and the silver key. He realized that the mystery of his uncle's house had evolved into a war for the future, and he was currently cornered in the past. The heavy crunch of combat boots on dry timber echoed through the skeletal remains of the post office. Thomas felt his pulse thrumming in his throat. He looked at Maya. Her face was set in a mask of grim concentration. She wasn't looking for a way out. She was looking for a way through. She reached into her utility jacket and pulled out a small, copper-bound cylinder, no larger than a roll of coins. When I say run, don't look back. She whispered. Head for the old mine shaft behind the general store. It's marked with a white X. The first security guard stepped into the doorway, his silhouette backlit by a powerful tactical floodlight from the street. The light cut through the dust, turning the air into a shimmering wall of particles. Found them. The guard said into his shoulder. He raised his rifle, the red dot of the laser sight dancing across Thomas's chest. Hands where I can see them. Drop the satchel. Thomas didn't move. He felt the weight of the silver key in his pocket. A piece of history that felt like it was growing heavier by the second. Now! Maya shouted. She twisted the copper cylinder and hurled it at the guard's feet. There was no explosion, but a sudden, violent burst of high-frequency sound erupted from the device. It wasn't a noise so much as a physical pressure. The guard dropped his rifle, clutching his ears as his knees buckled. Even Thomas felt his teeth ache and his vision blur. Run! Maya grabbed Thomas's arm and yanked him toward the back of the room. They didn't go for the door. Maya kicked a section of the wall, a part that looked like solid stone but was actually a cleverly disguised hatch of painted canvas and light wood. It swung outward, revealing a narrow alleyway choked with tumbleweeds. They scrambled through, the high-frequency shriek behind them already beginning to fade. Behind them, shouts of confusion erupted. Flashlight beams swept the darkness like frantic lighthouse lamps. Thomas and Maya sprinted through the ruins of red rock, their shadows leaping long and jagged against the crumbling brick walls. They reached the general store. Behind it, a massive timber frame stood over a dark, yawning hole in the earth. A faded white X was painted on the main support beam. "Into the bucket," Maya commanded, pointing to a rusted iron or skip hanging from a thick steel cable. "Is it even safe?" Thomas asked, looking at the frayed cable. "It's either the cable or the guys with the rifles," she retorted. They climbed into the cold, metal bucket. Maya reached out and pulled a lever on the rusted winch mechanism. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of complaining metal, the bucket jerked and began to descend into the darkness. Above them, the light of the moon disappeared, replaced by the damp, suffocating black of the deep earth. The descent was slow and agonizing. The iron bucket scraped against the rock walls of the shaft, sending showers of sparks into the dark. Thomas gripped the rim of the skip so hard his knuckles turned white. Below them, the air changed. It became cooler, tinged with the scent of wet stone and something metallic, like the taste of a copper penny. "This mine hasn't been used for gold in 80 years. Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the rattling of the cable. But Sarah discovered it connects to the primary limestone caverns. It's a back door to the aquifer system. The bucket hit the bottom with a bone-jarring thud. They climbed out into a tunnel that felt ancient. Unlike the rough-hewn shafts above, the walls here were smooth, worn down by millions of years of moving water. Thomas clicked on his flashlight. The beam revealed a path that descended deeper into the earth. "Look," Thomas said, pointing to the ground. Carved into the stone at the entrance of the tunnel was a small desert lily, identical to the one on the silver key. Beside it were the numbers: 36.4, 117.2. The frequency and the coordinates. Maya said, her eyes widening. She didn't just leave a map in the post office. She left a guide in the stone. "Those numbers tell us exactly how to tune the tracer." She took the small glass vial of iridescent blue liquid from the satchel. "This isn't just a chemical, Thomas. It's a bioluminescent catalyst. If we reach the Whispering Arch, the point where the three main rivers meet, we can use the silver key to open the flow. Once this liquid hits the water, it will react with the specific minerals here and light up the entire desert floor from underneath. Every hidden pipe Aura Water has installed will become visible to the satellites. You want to expose them," Thomas realized. "Not just stop them, but show the world what they've done. Sunlight is the best disinfectant." Maya replied. They began to walk. The tunnel grew wider, the ceiling rising into a vast dome. As they moved, the sound began. It started as a low hum, vibrating in their chests. Then, it evolved into a series of overlapping echoes, sounds of rushing water, clicking stones, and a strange, rhythmic thudding. "The echoes," Thomas whispered. "It sounds like the house, but louder. We're getting close to the heart," Maya said. Suddenly, Thomas's flashlight caught something in the distance. It wasn't stone or water. It was a structure of glass and steel, built directly into the side of the cavern. It looked like a modern laboratory, but it was overgrown with strange, pale moss. On the door was a logo Thomas knew all too well, but it wasn't the blue wave of Aura Water. It was a symbol of a sun rising over a mountain. "That's the original 85 expedition logo," Thomas said, stepping closer. The one from the photo. The door was slightly ajar. From inside, a soft, golden light was glowing, not from a lamp, but from thousands of tiny, glowing crystals reflecting off the walls. And in the center of the room, sitting at a desk covered in dust, was a man whose back was turned to them. He was wearing a dark wool coat. Thomas approached the desk with a heavy heart. The man in the dark wool coat did not move. He sat perfectly still, his head bowed as if in deep prayer or heavy sleep. The golden light from the crystals made his silhouette appear as if it were etched in gold leaf. Maya stayed back, her hand hovering over the copper cylinder in her pocket. "Hello," Thomas whispered. The word felt too loud in the pressurized silence of the lab. The man slowly turned his head. His face was a map of deep lines and sun-damaged skin, but his eyes were bright, almost unnaturally so. He wasn't Uncle Henry, nor was he the lawyer. He was a man Thomas had only seen in the corner of one very old, blurred photograph. This was Silas, the lead geologist who had supposedly died in the 1985 fire. "You have the eyes of a traveler," Silas said, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. "And you have Henry's chin. You must be the boy from the letters." "Letters?" Thomas asked, confused. "Henry never mentioned you were alive." Silas gave a weak, whistling laugh. "Alive is a generous word. I am a part of the system now. Henry kept me here, hidden from White and the others, to ensure the machine never truly died. I am the maintenance man of the underworld." He gestured to the glowing crystals. "The resonance, the echoes, they keep the mind sharp, but they take the body's strength." Maya stepped forward. "We have the tracer, Silas. And we have the silver key. Orawater is right behind us. They have a security team in the mine." Silas's expression sharpened. He looked at the glass vial in Thomas's hand. "The blue catalyst. Sarah's final gift. If you use that, the whole world will see the veins of this desert. But understand this, Thomas, once the light is cast, the secret is gone forever. The water will belong to everyone, but it will also be vulnerable to everyone. It's better than being controlled by one corporation." Thomas said, "True." Silas sighed. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, brass tuning fork. "You'll need this. The whispering arch is sensitive. If the frequency isn't perfect when you pour the catalyst, the reaction will be violent. It will turn the water to steam and collapse the tunnels." A distant explosion rocked the cavern. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, coating the glowing crystals in a layer of gray. The sound of shouting voices and the rhythmic heavy boots echoed from the tunnel they had just escaped. "Go," Silas said, turning back to his desk. "The arch is through the southern vent. Use the key to unlock the pressure plate. I will stay here and give them something else to look at." They ran through the southern vent, a narrow passage that smelled of ozone and wet limestone. The ground was vibrating now, a low-frequency hum that Thomas could feel in his teeth. Maya led the way, her flashlight beam bouncing off the slick walls. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Flashlight beams flickered in the dark like the eyes of predators. "Here." Maya stopped at a circular chamber where the floor was a massive, rotating disc of polished steel. In the center was a pedestal with a keyhole shaped like a desert lily. This was the manual override for the entire aquifer. The whispering arch loomed above them, a natural formation of white quartz that spanned the width of a massive underground river. The water below was moving fast, a black torrent that sounded like a freight train. "The key, Thomas. Quickly." Thomas fumbled for the silver key. His hands were shaking. He could hear the security team breaking into Silas's lab. He heard Silas's voice, calm and defiant, before a loud crash signaled the end of the conversation. There was no time to mourn. He jammed the silver key into the pedestal. The steel floor groaned. The massive disc began to rotate, the gears below grinding with the sound of 1,000 stones. "Wait!" A voice boomed. Thomas looked up. Standing at the edge of the chamber was a man in a sharp, grey suit, completely out of place in the dirt and darkness. He was accompanied by 4 armed guards. This was Director Thorn, the head of Aurawater. "You're making a mistake, Thomas," Thorn said, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "You think you're being a hero, but the state cannot manage this resource. We provide stability. We provide order. If you release that tracer, you create a resource war that will last for decades. You already started the war," Thomas said, his hand gripping the key. "You're just mad I'm the one holding the map." "Shoot the pedestal," Thorn commanded calmly. One of the guards raised his rifle. Thomas didn't hesitate. He twisted the silver key with all his might. The floor didn't just move, it dropped. The pedestal sank into the ground, and a massive pressure valve opened with a hiss of steam. "The tuning fork," Maya yelled. Thomas struck the brass fork against the steel rim. A clear, piercing note rang out, vibrating against the quartz of the Whispering Arch. At that exact moment, he uncorked the vial and poured the iridescent blue liquid into the rushing water below. The reaction was instantaneous. As the blue catalyst hit the black water, a cold, sapphire light exploded from the river. It wasn't a fire. It was a chemical glow so bright it turned the dark cavern into a midday landscape. The light followed the current, racing down the tunnels and into the veins of the earth. The quartz arch above them caught the light, refracting it into 1,000 rainbows that danced across the ceiling. The security guards shielded their eyes, blinded by the sudden radiance. Director Thorn staggered back, his face a mask of pure fury. "What have you done?" Thorn screamed. "I've turned on the lights," Thomas replied. Through the cracks in the cavern walls, they could see the light spreading. It moved through old mining pipes, through hidden corporate conduits, and into the natural limestone channels. Miles above them, on the surface of the desert, the blue light would be visible through the thin crust of the salt flats. The world would see the illegal infrastructure Aurawater had spent billions to hide. "We have to go. The pressure is equalizing." Maya grabbed Thomas and pulled him toward a narrow maintenance ladder. The chamber began to fill with a fine mist. The blue light was beautiful, but the sound was terrifying, a deep, booming resonance that felt like the earth itself was clearing its throat. The echoes were no longer whispers. They were a roar. As they climbed, Thomas looked back. He saw Director Thorn standing at the edge of the glowing river, staring at the blue light. The man looked small and insignificant against the power of the water. The silver key was still in the pedestal, locked in place, its job finished. They reached the top of the ladder and squeezed through a narrow vent that led to the surface. When they emerged, the cool night air hit them like a blessing. Thomas collapsed onto the sand, gasping for breath. He looked toward the horizon. The desert was no longer dark. 4 miles in every direction, a faint, ghostly blue glow pulsed beneath the sand. It looked like a map of the stars had been buried underground. It was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen. "Look," Maya whispered, pointing to the sky. A fleet of news helicopters and government planes was already circling. The secret was out. The Oasis of Echoes was no longer a ghost story. It was a reality that the whole world was watching. The desert was crawling with activity. Within hours of the luminescent flood, the quiet wasteland had become a staging ground for the largest environmental investigation in history. Tents were erected, and heavy equipment marked with government seals hummed alongside the glowing cracks in the earth. Thomas and Maya sat on the tailgate of a Federal Rangers truck, wrapped in heavy blankets. They found Silas. A ranger told them. He's alive. He's in a medical transport heading for the city. He's asking for a cup of real coffee and a newspaper from 1986. Thomas felt a small weight lift from his chest. Anne Thorne. In custody. The ranger said with a grim smile. His own security team turned on him once they realized the whole world was watching the blue map on the evening news. Hard to claim you're not stealing water when the pipes are glowing through the dirt. Thomas looked at his hands. They were stained with the blue dye of the catalyst, a mark that would likely take weeks to fade. He felt a strange sense of emptiness. The key was gone, left in the heart of the machine. The mystery that had started with a letter from his uncle was finally over. What happens now? Thomas asked Maya. Now the lawyers take over. Maya said, leaning her head on his shoulder. But the water is public now. The state is already drafting a restoration plan for the valley. We're going to turn the forbidden zone into a protected park. We're going to let the desert heal. My uncle, Thomas said quietly. He spent his whole life protecting this. He was a prisoner of it. He was a guardian. Thomas. Maya corrected. He just didn't know how to ask for help. He waited for someone he could trust. He waited for you. As the sun began to rise, the blue glow beneath the sand started to fade, overwhelmed by the golden light of the morning. But the world had seen it. The Oasis of Echoes would never be silent again. Thomas stood up, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He was ready to go home, but he knew that a part of him would always belong to the sand and the secrets hidden beneath it. 2 weeks later, Thomas returned to the mansion. It was no longer a place of fear. The government had cleared the sand from the windows, and the electricity had been restored. The local university had taken over the maintenance of the aquifer regulator in the basement. Uncle Henry was sitting in the library, looking much stronger. He was surrounded by books and maps, working with a team of young hydrologists. When he saw Thomas, he stood up and gave him a long, silent hug. You did it, Thomas. Henry whispered. You finished the work, Sarah, and I started. I can finally sleep without hearing the pipes screaming. The key is still down there, Thomas said. I had to leave it to open the bypass. Good. Henry smiled. That's where it belongs. It's part of the machine now. It's part of the desert. Thomas walked through the house, remembering the dark hallways and the secret doors. It felt different now. The air was clear, and the sound of the wind outside was just wind, not a warning. He went to the kitchen and saw Elena. She wasn't wearing her housekeeper's uniform anymore. She was wearing a lab coat, analyzing water samples. Hello, Thomas, she said, offering a genuine smile. The water quality is improving. The salt levels are dropping. The oasis is actually coming back. I saw the first sprouts near the Red Rock outpost, Thomas said. Green grass in the middle of the dunes. It looked impossible. Nothing is impossible if you have the right frequency. She laughed. Thomas looked out the kitchen window toward the desert. He saw a small, silver bird, not a corporate drone, but a real hawk, circling high in the sky. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he first arrived. The mystery was gone, replaced by a future that was bright, clear, and full of life. While Henry and the team were busy in the library, Thomas found himself drawn back to the study. Even with the sand gone and the lights on, the room held a certain gravity. He sat at the desk where he had first found the photo of 1985. He realized there was one thing he hadn't fully explored: the hollow book on shelf 10. He pulled the empty shell of the book from the shelf. He looked at the spine. There was no title, but upon closer inspection, he noticed a faint indentation in the leather. It wasn't letters. It was a thumbprint. Henry's thumbprint. Thomas realized. He pressed his own thumb against the spot. To his surprise, a small hidden compartment in the back cover of the book clicked open. Inside was not a key, but a single, thin sheet of gold foil. It was covered in microscopic writing, etched with a diamond tip. To my heir. The message began. The water is the beginning, but the resonance is the end. The echoes are not just the sound of the earth. They are a bridge. There are other places like this, places where the earth speaks. I have found 4 others. One in the Arctic, one in the Andes, one in the Congo, and one beneath the sea. The silver key was only the first. Thomas felt a cold shiver. The Oasis of Echoes wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was part of a global network. Henry and Sarah hadn't just found water. They had found a planetary system that was being ignored or exploited all over the world. Thomas. He looked up. Maya was standing in the doorway. She saw the gold foil in his hand. Her expression shifted from curiosity to a deep, knowing concern. "What is it?" she asked. "It's a map," Thomas said, his voice a whisper. "A bigger map. Henry didn't just want me to save the mansion. He wanted me to see the whole world." Maya walked over and looked at the microscopic etchings. "The Andes," she read, pointing to a set of coordinates. "That's near the high-altitude salt flats. There have been reports of strange acoustic phenomena there for years." Thomas looked at the silver key, or rather, the memory of it. He realized that the end of one mystery was simply the beginning of a much larger journey. The desert had been his classroom, but the world was now his laboratory. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Maya asked, a spark of adventure in her eyes. "I think we need to pack," Thomas replied. The packing didn't take long. Thomas didn't need much, just his journal, the gold foil, and a sturdy pair of boots. He said his goodbyes to Henry and Elena. They understood. They had spent their lives guarding one secret. They knew the call of the others. "Take care of her, Thomas," Henry said, nodding toward Maya. "And take care of the earth. It's louder than people think." As Thomas and Maya drove away from the mansion, the desert looked different. It wasn't a wasteland. It was a living, breathing entity. They drove past the red rock outpost, where the green grass was already taller. They drove past the salt flats, where the blue glow had left a faint, permanent shimmer in the quartz. "Next stop, Santiago," Maya asked, checking her phone for flight details. "Santiago." Thomas agreed. They reached the airport just as the sun was setting. Thomas looked at the busy terminal, the people rushing to catch their flights, unaware of the echoes beneath their feet. He felt like he was walking between 2 worlds. He was no longer just a nephew or a student. He was a traveler. As they waited at the gate, Thomas opened his journal and began to write. He wrote about the mansion, the storm, the silver key, and the blue light. He wrote about Sarah and Silas. He wrote it all down so he would never forget the lessons of the sand. Flight 402 to Santiago is now boarding, the intercom announced. Thomas stood up and grabbed his bag. He felt the gold foil against his chest, a warm weight. He looked at Maya and smiled. They weren't just running away from a corporation. They were running toward a new understanding of the planet. "Ready?" Maya asked. "Ready," Thomas said. They walked down the jet bridge and into the plane. As the aircraft took off, Thomas looked out the window. The desert was a vast, dark expanse. But he knew the truth now. He knew what lay beneath. And he knew that wherever they went, the earth would be waiting to tell them its story. The air in the Andes was thin and sharp, a complete contrast to the heavy, dusty heat of the desert. Thomas and Maya were standing at the edge of the Salar de Uyuni, the world's largest salt flat. It was a mirror of white, reflecting the brilliant blue sky so perfectly that it was hard to tell where the earth ended and the heavens began. The coordinates on the foil lead right to the center of the solar. Maya said, adjusting her oxygen mask. But there's no mansion here. No pipes. No visible infrastructure. It's not about infrastructure, Thomas said, remembering Silas's words. It's about resonance. He took out the brass tuning fork. He struck it against a small, protruding rock of volcanic basalt. The sound didn't fade. It hit the salt crust and seemed to amplify, a clear, ringing tone that traveled for miles across the white expanse. Suddenly, the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't a violent movement, but a rhythmic pulse. The salt crust cracked in a perfect circle around them. From beneath the white surface, a soft, violet light began to glow. Violet. Maya whispered. The desert was blue. The mountains are violet. Different frequencies. Thomas realized. Different elements in the water. As they watched, a small, crystalline spire began to rise from the center of the circle. It wasn't made of stone. It looked like frozen water, translucent and glowing with an inner light. At the top of the spire was a small, familiar opening. Another keyhole. Thomas said. But he didn't have the silver key. He looked at the gold foil in his hand. He realized the foil wasn't just a map. He folded the foil into a specific, intricate shape. A shape he had seen in one of Sarah's old diagrams. He inserted the folded foil into the spire. The violet light flared. The hum became a song, a complex, multi-layered melody that seemed to fill the entire valley. Thomas felt a sudden, profound connection to the earth. He could feel the water moving miles below. He could feel the pressure of the tectonic plates. He could feel the heartbeat of the mountains. It's a receiver, Thomas said, his eyes wide. The mansion was the transmitter. This is the receiver. They are communicating. The violet song continued for several minutes, a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to harmonize with the wind. As Thomas and Maya stood on the salt flat, they saw other lights appearing on the horizon, tiny pinpricks of color that shouldn't have been there. Look. Maya pointed to the north. A green light. And to the south, a red one. The other locations. Thomas realized. The foil activated the network. They're all waking up. For the first time, the true scale of Henry and Sarah's discovery became clear. It wasn't just a way to manage water. It was a planetary nervous system. Each oasis was a node in a vast, ancient network that regulated the Earth's most vital processes. The sand, the mountains, the ice, and the sea, they were all connected. Aura Water only saw the profit. Maya said, her voice full of awe. They were trying to steal a drop of water from a system that manages the entire planet. They were like children playing with a nuclear reactor. Thomas added. Suddenly, the violet spire began to retract. The light faded, and the song drifted into a low, comforting hum. The salt crust settled back into place, leaving only a small, faint circle to mark the spot. The other lights on the horizon disappeared as well, returning to their secret sleep. We need to find the others, Thomas said, his voice firm. We need to make sure they're safe. We need to be the guardians Henry wanted us to be. The Arctic is next, Maya said, checking the coordinates. The red light in the ice. Thomas looked at the white expanse of the solar. He felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than anything he had ever known. He was no longer just a witness to a mystery. He was a participant in a story that was millions of years old. Let's go, he said. They walked back toward their jeep, their shadows long against the white salt. The mystery of the mansion was gone, replaced by a mission that would take them across the globe. They were the keepers of the echoes, and the journey was only just beginning. The transition from the salt flats to the frozen wilderness of the Arctic was a brutal test of endurance. Thomas and Maya were now on a research vessel, cutting through the thick pack ice of the Beaufort Sea. The red light was calling to them from beneath a massive glacier on a remote, unnamed island. The air is even thinner here than in the Andes, Maya noted, her breath visible in the freezing air. And the interference is off the charts. The compasses are spinning like tops. That means we're close, Thomas said. They reached the island and began the trek across the ice. The echoes here were different. Sharp, cracking sounds that echoed through the frozen silence. The ground beneath them wasn't rock. It was ancient ice, hundreds of feet thick. They found the spot. In the center of a deep, crystalline valley, a soft, red glow was emanating from deep within the glacier. It looked like a giant, frozen heart. How do we get to it? Maya asked, looking at the solid wall of ice. Thomas took out the tuning fork and the gold foil. This time, he didn't need to strike the fork. As he approached the ice, the fork began to vibrate on its own, a high-pitched whine that grew louder with every step. The red light intensified, the ice beginning to hum in resonance. It's not about breaking the ice, Thomas said. It's about asking it to open. He hummed the melody he had heard in the Andes. It was a strange, haunting tune, but as he sang, the ice began to shift. A narrow, smooth-walled tunnel formed in the face of the glacier, leading directly toward the red heart. They entered the tunnel, the air inside surprisingly warm. At the end of the passage, they found a chamber of pure, clear ice. In the center was a massive, pulsing crystal of red obsidian, suspended in a sphere of flowing water. The thermal regulator, Thomas realized. This node manages the temperature of the currents. If this is tampered with, the weather patterns of the entire hemisphere shift. He placed his hand on the obsidian crystal. He felt a rush of information, a sensory overload of temperatures, currents, and pressures. He saw the fragility of the system, and the beauty of its balance. He knew what he had to do. He used the foil to lock the frequency, ensuring that the node would remain stable and hidden from any further corporate interference. 3 down, Maya said, her face illuminated by the red glow. 2 to go. The final node was beneath the sea, in a deep trench off the coast of the Congo. Thomas and Maya sat on the deck of a small boat, watching the sun dip below the Atlantic horizon. They had traveled thousands of miles, faced countless dangers, and seen things that no human was ever meant to see. They had secured the nodes, protected the echoes, and honored the legacy of Sarah and Henry. It's done, Thomas said, looking at the final entry in his journal. The network is stable. The corporate trackers have given up. The world is safe, at least for now. We did it, Thomas, Maya said, taking his hand. They looked out at the ocean, the water dark and mysterious. They knew that deep below, a green light was pulsing, a silent guardian of the deep. They knew that the earth was speaking, and that they were among the few who could hear it. Thomas felt the silver key in his pocket. Not the physical key, but a small, silver replica he had made to remind him of where it all started. He remembered the mansion in the sand, the smell of dust, and the flickering light of a single candle. He remembered his uncle's face, and the weight of a secret that was too big for one man. What do we do now? Maya asked. We keep listening, Thomas said. We stay ready. The earth is always changing, and there will always be those who try to exploit its silence. We are the ones who hear the echoes. The sun disappeared, leaving a trail of gold and purple across the sky. The stars began to appear, reflecting in the calm water. Thomas felt a deep, abiding peace. He had found his place in the world. He was a keeper, a traveler, and a son of the desert. And as the boat rocked gently in the waves, he closed his eyes and listened to the song of the earth, a song that would never end.